What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like the magic, all the stuff that you know by now. And today, I am undertaking the probably the most foolhardy thing I've ever done as a content creator. I was thinking to myself, you know, rather than just be lazy and do our traditional pre-release guide, which is already a pretty deep dive, let's go even deeper and talk about every single card in the entire set in one video and rate them for sealed play specifically at the same time, so you know what you're getting into going into your pre-release. Now, I know I'm probably inviting a great deal of calumny and consternation here, but at the same time, it's going to be a fun exercise for me and hopefully for you as well. We don't have much time to waste, so I want to go ahead and get into it, but couple of things here, you know how it is. Call to action first, but since I'm a nice guy, while I'm doing the call to action, here's timestamps for all the different colors and such on the right side of your screen here. Before we really get into it here, make sure that you like the video if you enjoy this kind of content. Subscribe, even if you're not the kind of person. I know that most people don't ever subscribe to a single YouTube channel, but all I can say is that your subscription would really mean a lot to me as I go through this today. And, of course, if you want to pre-order any of the stuff we talk about, go to TCG Player. First link in the description down there. They got singles and sealed product for you at super cheap prices. And if you really want to reward me for this massive, ridiculous, stupid project that I've decided to task ourselves with, then you can always click the link in the description and donate to the Patreon. Lots of rewards and stuff if you do so. But let's go ahead and get into it with one final little footnote here, and that is LSV's rating. Luis Scott Vargas, one of the best in the world, no matter how you slice it, has a pretty standard rating scale that is kind of, again, the gold standard for how cards are ranked for limited at the very least. You know, 0.5 is low-end playables and sideboard material. So again, very low-end playables. Keep that in mind. Sometimes a card will get a sub-1 grade and still be possible to play. 1 is bad filler that gets cut most of the time. 1.5 is filler that gets cut about half of the time. So you will play 1.5 cards. It seems like a really, really bad score, right? But you will play occasionally cards that score 1.5. Same thing with 2. Good filler sometimes gets cut about half the time or so. 2.5. Solid playable rarely gets cut. 3, the language is very similar here between 2.5 and 3, honestly. Good playable that basically always makes the cut. But a 2.5 is a solid playable that rarely gets cut, which is, again, very similar. 3.5, top tier common or solid uncommon. 4, good rare or top tier uncommon, so we're getting into some really good stuff here. And then 4.5, incredible bomb, but not unbeatable. And of course 5 is the best of the best. Most cards will not receive this kind of rating. But I'm rating all of these off the top of my head. I've kind of gone through here a couple of times, plus I've covered spoilers all season and been brewing with a few of these cards too, so I've got a very good idea of what all the cards do, but I have no idea what rating I'm going to assign to the vast majority of these. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're doing it, y'all. We are actually in the driver's seat now. I hope you guys are strapped in. Let's go. Let's go to the white cards to start things off with. We'll go through the color pie here, starting with a Johnny Strength of the Pride. Johnny is obviously a pretty strong card. This just creates a Johnny's Pride mates and does so at least twice while still surviving and staying on the battlefield if you're able to protect it. And that is very good. Plus, you'll use the first ability quite a bit, especially to sort of restock its loyalty so you can continue to make Pride mates. So this is a creature factory that does other things, and if you're actually able to pull this, you know, ultimate, quote, ultimate for 0 off in sealed and win the game, then achievement unlocked. There's a few cards like this in this sealed environment. It's going to be, you know, 1 out of 1,000 games that happens, so it's really not worth mentioning. It's all about the -2 here, and for that alone, this is a very strong card. I'll go ahead and give it a 4.5. As far as Cavalier of Dawn, this requires a very high white mana commitment, as do all of these Cavaliers, but the dividends really pay out here. Just again, like with all of the Cavaliers, but this is one of the stronger ones. It's very often you won't want to give your opponent a 3/3, but if it means destroying their 5/5 flying bomb, you'll definitely take that. And sometimes you'll just blow up one of your own creatures and get a 3/3. You know, blow up a small guy, get a 3/3 of your own, so you just bring 7 power onto the battlefield effectively. -1 or 2, whatever you blew up. So this card is not bad, and of course you get a little bit of value possibly back when it dies. Again, just like all the other Cavaliers, but this isn't one of the strongest Cavalier dies triggers. So as far as the stats alone though, 4/6 vigilance for 5 mana, that's very strong, but unless again you're heavily committed to white, it's going to be relatively tough to cast this card on time. So I'm going to give this one a 4. Very, very strong card obviously, but it's definitely got a fair amount of limitations. As far as Bishop of Wings, first rare card in white, this doesn't look super good because it's not. There are a total of 4 angels in the limited environment right now, and most of them are at lower rarities. There is one that is rare, you see it on your screen right now, but even though most of them are uncommon, I still don't think that that's near enough angels to guarantee getting that many in your sealed pool and playing this card. The best thing about it is it's a 2-mana 1/4, blocks on the ground all day, lets you get into the late game if you're trying to execute that kind of plan. But for the most part, this isn't going to be very good unless you have maybe 2-3 angels in your deck, and that's going to be a lot harder to do than it sounds. So I'm going to give Bishop of Wings a solid 1, possibly a 1.5, but I think I'm going to go with 1 here. Brought Back is actually a little bit more narrow than it appears to be in the limited environment, where it's a lot harder to set up something like this for combo purposes at the very least, but it's still going to get stuff back that died in combat, and that can be a potential blowout, but there's still some opportunity cost to putting this in your deck. It's going to sit dead in your hand some turns, but other turns it's going to be very easy to get value off of this just by swinging your creatures into combat. That said, this will maybe be a card that people start looking out for as the sealed environment develops, but we're talking about pre-release here, so I'm not sure too many people are going to know to play around Brought Back, and it's a rare, so even if you know the card exists and you think of playing around it, you still have to make them have it, right? So it's very unlikely that they'll have this. But at the same time, it is a really, really nice trick, and you can get blown out by it. And when you actually play the card, again, getting back effectively card advantage, 2 cards from the graveyard that died this turn. Sometimes they're planeswalkers too, that you may have minus them to death or something like that. So this can be a very good card, but again, very, very narrow, especially in a format where you have a limited card pool and you can't really build around it the way you want to. So I'll give this one a 1/2, with the caveat that you can blow out people with this on some occasions. Hanged Executioner, I think, is one of the better rares in white in this set. I like that it goes ahead and gives you 2 flying creatures, and flying is very important in this limited environment, and it's a lot more prevalent than usual. There's a lot of payoffs to flying, and so they baked in far more flyers, nearly twice as many flyers as they usually do at the lower rarity in limited. I will go ahead and tell you that there are 40 flying creatures in this limited environment, plus other ways of giving creatures flying. Now, when I say 40 flying creatures, there's like a red 2-drop that's able to give itself flying. There's a red 4-drop that only has flying on your turn. I'm counting all of these. So 40 flying creatures, and 28 or 29 of them are at common and uncommon. So there are a lot of flyers in this limited environment. It's very important. And Hanged Executioner is, I think, one of the better ones. As far as blocking bodies, it's not incredible when compared to the other flyers in the format, but it does help you go wide, and especially when you have evasiveness on those bodies, that's very important. Plus, it's just removal, and removal's at a premium. So I give this card a 4.5. I don't think it's going to put me in white if I open it up, but it can take me a long way towards wanting to play white, and just premium removal like this is always good. Even if you use it as a removal, it's going to leave a body behind that flies too. So just so many uses for this, both defensively and offensively, excuse me. First flub of the video as far as the getting tongue-tied there, but still, I think this is a very strong card. I'll give it a 4.5. I do want to play Hanged Executioner. I think it's got a lot of applications. Leyline of Sanctity is more or less garbage in limited. I'll go ahead and give this like a 0.5 just for the chance it might be sideboardable, but I highly doubt it. Loxodon Life Chanter. This will be the highest priority creature to kill as soon as it hits the battlefield. It is a little bit expensive, but it's very splashable. Only costs the 1 colored mana. 6 mana, again, a little bit much, but 4/6 are at least decent stats. Blocks well on the ground, and of course, when it goes to attack, if you have 6 mana to pump into it, it's a great mana sink in the late game, and it's always going to threaten like hardcore on attacks. Even if it only gets like +3/+3 because you're at an extremely low life total, it still gets really, really imposing on attacks, and even on blocks if you have the extra mana. So I really like this. If you have like 2 or 3 other creatures out when you play it, then suddenly your life total can actually reset to a pretty nice level. So I'm going to go ahead and give this one a 4.5 as well. I think that white has some really, really bomb rares, like Planar Cleansing, for instance. I'm going to go ahead and tell you I'm only going to give this a 4, even though it looks like an insane bomb, but again, the white commitment is incredibly high here, and chances are, if you're in white, you're playing non-land permanents in this set at the very least, in this sealed environment, that you might not want to blow up. So there's some push-pull to playing this card. There are pure control strategies in this environment, but they're not as available as they usually are, especially in sealed, where again you really don't have any control over what your card pool is. It's going to be really difficult to build a control-y deck, or at least more so than usual, and planar cleansing is not as powerful as it may appear at first glance. Yeah, it's a ridiculously powerful card, but you won't necessarily play it all the time, and again the commitment to white is so high here that it's going to be tough to play this card, especially again considering that if you do play white and you have to make all this white mana, you want to play cards like Saphara Sky's Blade and a lot of the other really good white creatures in rare and uncommon. Saphara is just crazy. Again, commitment to white is extremely high, and the casting cost is a bit prohibitive here because it's very likely that you won't have 4 flying creatures out. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. Again, you can unlock an achievement if you pull this off, because again, there are a buttload of flying creatures in this format, way more so than usual. So you won't always have to cast it for 7 mana, but very often I think you will, more often than not. So I'm going to give this a 4, because once it does hit the battlefield, its first priority must kill removal wins the game for you, often in one swing. Even if they don't lose in one swing, it's still a 14-point life swing, so it's just ridiculous if it gets through. Even if it doesn't get through, it eats a creature and gets you 7 lives. It's just crazy what this does for you in combat, either on attacks or blocks. So just an insane card, but there is a little bit of, you know, greed to playing this card. Very expensive, very high commitment. Starfield Mystic, just okay, you know, just a filler card. Again, a 2-mana 2/2. That's a creature you'll sometimes play just to fill your deck out. And if you do have more than a couple of enchantments in your library, it's not so bad. You know, I think all in all, there are 11 auras, and they're all at common and uncommon in this set. And that's not even counting other enchantments and such. So this could be okay, but you have to have a pretty high degree of enchantments and auras and such. And again, this looks like more of a draft card if you're trying to build that kind of deck, the auras deck, than it is a sealed card where you have almost no control over a card like this. So I'll give it like a 1.5, I think, possibly even a 1, honestly, because this card is not incredible, to say the least. Let's go on down here to Ancestral Blade. I actually really like this card. This is just, again, a 2-mana 2/2, kind of a bear, but if you get it in the late game, then you can go ahead and attach that, you know, +1 power to a flyer or something, get through, and it always puts a body on the battlefield. I like these kind of living equipment artifacts, and I think all of these colored artifacts are actually very good this time around. And Ancestral Blade is just kind of a bread and butter card, so I'll give it a 3 or a 3.5. Let's say a 3. This will rarely get cut, and it's a very solid playable. Same thing with Angel of Vitality, though. 3-mana 2/2 flying. Those are Windrake stats. We often like those. And if you gain life, you gain that much life +1 instead, and there's a fair amount of life gain in this set, especially in white and black for that matter. So, and even green, as a matter of fact, there's a fair amount of life gain. So this does have a chance of getting you a really nice amount of value over the course of a game. Even if it only procs 2 or 3 times, it's still value on a creature that you'd probably play in terms of pure stats anyway. So really like this. Going to be really tough to get 25 or more life in a format like Sealed. But at the same time, just on stats alone, it's a fine creature. I'll give this one a 3.5. I'd play it pretty much every time I got it as long as I was in white. Apostle of Purifying Light is one of those sideboard cards in a way. It does have protection from black, but there's a few things here. Black looks like a very strong color in this limited environment that I imagine a lot of people are going to be on. So there's very little opportunity cost to putting in your deck, especially on stats alone, where it's 2 power 2/1, and it can sometimes, you know, mess around with graveyard strategies, which there aren't a whole lot of, but if you spot like Blood for Bones in game 1 or something, then you know this can mess with your opponent's graveyard, and it has pro black, and you know they're playing black. So I think this is more of a sideboard thing, but instead of the 0.5 sideboard grade, I'll go ahead and bump it up to a 1, because I don't think there's that much opportunity cost to putting it in your deck to begin with. Next up is Devout Decree, which is another color hosing card. Exiling a creature or planeswalker that's black or red is a very strong sideboard card, even at sorcery, so we'll give it the 0.5 that sideboard cards get. You won't play this in your main deck most of the time, even with black being a very strong color in Sealed. I still don't see this coming in, you know, for game 1 at all. Eternal Isolation, pretty good looking piece of removal. pretty good, but again, a little bit narrow. There are a fair amount of 4 power and over creatures in this format, but still. I will say you play this in the main deck, though. This isn't just a sideboard card, but I wouldn't play more than 1 copy in the main deck in game 1, at the very least. So I'm going to give this a 2, just because being removal really moves it up a bunch of slots. This is a solid playable that you'll definitely play at least the 1 copy of. Fencing Ace, had a bunch of fun with this thing over the course of my Magic career, but it's really just a 2-mana 2/2. But do remember, again, there were 11 auras in the format, and a few combat tricks too that can increase this thing's power. But in terms of auras, I think 6 of them increase power, and then another one gives flying, which we'll get to eventually here. But with you, if you have any amount of these auras in your deck, Fencing Ace becomes like way better immediately. So it's kind of a variable grade, but it's a solid playable in and of itself. So I'll go ahead and give it a 2, because it won't get it won't make the cut every single time, but it's definitely one of the cards that's in contention for your deck, especially if you have cards that go with it well, like Gauntlets of Light, for instance. This is a very good card with Fencing Ace. There's a reason they're right there next to each other in the spoiler. Well, it's because they're alphabetical, but still. Gauntlets of Light. I think it's actually a much better card than it looks like at first glance. This effectively gives the creature +2/+2 and a pseudo vigilance, which is actually kind of nice depending on what it's on, especially if it's on a flyer. You want to get through for damage, but you also want to be up to block their flyers, because again, I think that's going to be a very important interplay in the sealed environment. So I'll give, even though the ability is kind of steep to use, I'll still give Gauntlets of Light kind of a solid 2 here, because you'll play this card some of the time, especially if you do get stuff like Fencing Ace that goes so well with it. God's Willing is an extremely good trick in this format that effectively just negates removal for 1 mana. It's kind of a dive down or something for white decks, and that's actually very good, because removal is at a premium in every sealed environment, every limited environment, bar none. So God's Willing will almost always make the slot, but this is another card that I'm not sure you want to play more than 1 copy of. You could probably do 2 copies of God's Willing, but I think you want to use your other limited slots on better stuff and threats and such. You have to play threats and removal in your limited deck, so you don't really have too many slots for these combat tricks and anti-removal tricks and such. But I will say, if you're on, a big board or something, you got a big dude you want to get through, this can give your creature protection and get through some of the time. So there's a lot of uses for God's Willing, and the Scry is really nice too. So I'll give this one a 2.5, because I think you're going to play it a lot of the time, but again, I'd watch out when playing other copies of it. Herald of the Sun is next. This is one of the better uncommons in white, I think, in the entire set. This is 6 mana 4/4 flying, and I think those are good enough stats to make it see play in pretty much every white deck. But the fact that you can use this ridiculous mana sink to just go over the top of even other decks that have big flying creatures is just going to win a lot of games in sealed, and I'm going to give this a 4.5. I know that seems like a ridiculously high grade, but again, if you're in white, you will 100% play this every time, no matter how many copies you'll get, you'll play all of them. Even at 6 mana, I think it's absolutely worth playing this in sealed. So I'll give this a 4.5. I was gonna go down to 4, but no. Sticking with it. Be courageous. I do think this is one of the best white uncommons in the set. We'll give it a 4.5. Loyal Pegasus, with so many creatures with flying in the set, this is the best it's ever been in the sealed environment, hands down. It's literally like twice as good as it usually is. It's just a ridiculous creature right now that's going to at least be a body on the battlefield for some purposes. Whether you have cards that count the number of creatures you have, whatever. There are a few of those in this limited environment, but as soon as you play another creature with flying, it turns on, and it's just incredible. This creature both attacks and blocks really well, trades up very well as well. So, but of course, you have to have another creature to attack with it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a flying creature. I don't know why I said that, but as long as you have any other creature to attack with it, this is amazing. It's really good in aggressive decks, and so I see Loyal Pegasus being one of those cards that like speeds up an otherwise kind of slow-looking format, and I'll give this a solid 3 right now. You'll rarely cut this, but again, if you're in a slower deck, you probably don't want to play Pegasus. Let's move on to Master Splicer, which I think is another one of the best white uncommons, bar none. Just Master Splicer effectively brings 5 power onto the battlefield, because you get what is basically a 4/4 golem plus a 1/1. So not only do you get kind of a board in the box, 2 bodies, I always like to advance the board state, obviously, in sealed, and you get a lot of power for how much you're actually paying. The rate is very good. Plus, if you're doing the math on golems, there's just as many golems in sealed as there are angels, but they're all at lower rarities, and angels has a rare. So I guess if you're keeping score, that's a little bit better. So you might be able to get some ancillary value on another golem or 2 every now and again. So this isn't actually that bad of a card at all, and I would give this at least a solid 4. As far as rule of law, though, this is probably bad. It's a fine card on the commander table in certain decks and can be really unfair in the right situation, but just at first glance, I'm not seeing like that many ways of breaking rule of law, especially in sealed. So I'll just give this a 0.5. It might even be a 0. Like, this is more or less unplayable unless you have very specific things you're doing with it, but I don't think those tricks are very available in sealed. As far as Aerial Assault, great card, just because it's removal. Again, removal at a premium, you'll always play removal. And destroying a tap creature is a little bit limited, and it's not super great in like aggressive decks or anything, but still a fine card and pays you off for playing those flyers that you're going to play anyway, and also helps you out with any life gain themes. You got the Flying Angel. This plays really well with that, obviously. So just because it's a removal piece, I'll give this a 3.5 because you're going to play it pretty much every time. Angelic Gift is the aura that grants flying and does so for a cheap thing, very cheap cost. And draws you a card too. So I don't think you're going to play this every single time, but I actually could be wrong about that. So I'll go ahead and give this a 2.5. Solid playable that probably doesn't get cut very often. Battalion Foot Soldier is really just a 3-mana 2/2. It being at the common level means that you're going to get more copies of this some of the time. And if you get like 3 copies of it in your sealed pool, which is unlikely but possible, then it's very good. I'd say this is another like pretty variable grade here, but if you do get like 3 of these, or God forbid 4, and remember too, in sealed, if you get more than 4 of a card, you can play more than 4 of a card in sealed. That's not a rule in sealed, that you have to play just 4. So if you happen to somehow, by some ridiculous stroke of luck, get 5 Battalion Foot Soldiers, you can play all 5 of them in your sealed deck. It's totally legal. So if that happens, this card is just through the roof incredible, but just on its face, this card isn't much more than like a 1 or like a 0.5. I mean, it's a 3-mana 2/2, and that's just not a great rate. As far as Dawning Angel, this gets a little bit of extra points for just being an angel and working with life gain themes. 4 life is actually pretty steep, but so is 5 mana for a 2 toughness creature that will sometimes trade, but very rarely trade up in combat. So I'm just going to give this, I'd say a 3, because again, you're going to play it in a lot of white decks, especially the ones that want either angel value, which is going to be extremely few of them, or life gain value, which is going to be far more. So I do think that the card has plenty of uses, and 5 mana is just cheap enough to not be too steep to consider this card. So I think 3 is probably where I want to be on this card. Looks like bread and butter at the common level, but it definitely has its problems, 2 toughness being the highest one. Daybreak Chaplain, I actually really like. I've always liked this card, but again, there are life gain, like kind of a life game sub-theme, if you haven't noticed by now. And I think this is actually really good if you're trying to do the life gain sub-theme, and blocks really well in the early game against more aggressive decks. So I'll give this a 2, I think, because there are plenty of decks you want to play this in. Disenchant is sideboard fodder. This is a 0.5. Glaring Eye, even though I very much respect Disenchant, but it's still a 0.5, sorry. Glaring Igus, I'll give this a 1 because it's a pretty solid little thing to have, especially if you do have like a fencing ace or something, and it combines with the aura that makes your creature hit for toughness. Keep that in mind. So I really like the way these work together, but at the same time, it's not incredible. Pretty decent for aggressive decks, but I hate that it gives a toughness boost instead of a power boost. It's always been a really weird card, but I kind of like it. So I'll give Glaring Igus a 1. There are some decks you'll play it in because 1 mana is actually not that much for this effect, especially if you're an aggressive deck. You just want to attack. 1 mana is exactly what you want for this one-time effect, but it's really not much to write home about. Griffin Protector, another bread and butter common for white in limited. This is actually fantastic. Just 4 mana for a 2/3 flyer isn't the best rate in the world, but if you're able to play 1 creature a turn, this becomes a 3/4 flyer for forward, at which point this is a much different conversation. It's a great card. So you're not going to play a creature every turn, but there are cards like, say, Raise the Alarm, we'll get to that in just a second, that allow you to put multiple creatures on the battlefield at once, and it's not the only one. So, like for instance, we just looked at Master Splicer. That too puts 2 bodies on the battlefield, so this just becomes a 4-power flyer. And in those situations, the card is very good, and I think you'll almost always play this. We'll give it a 3.5. Griffin Sentinel, another card that I think looks really solid in these like flying decks, and it's always like way more annoying than it looks. I put a lot of hours into Duels of the Planeswalkers on PlayStation, and Griffin Sentinel in the sealed environment, in the one that had the sealed environment, was always like a really annoying card. So I think it's a little bit better than it looks, especially with flying strategies in the format. And I'll go ahead and give it a 2, because I don't think it's like incredible, but it's definitely a playable card. Inspired Charge, the aggressive decks will want this all day, but it's kind of another variable grade, because it's not insane if you're not in an aggressive deck. because even if you're in a mid-rangey thing that just plays a normal amount of creatures, this will sometimes be able to get you through in the late game, but not as much as you might think. You know, it doesn't grant trample or any other keyword abilities. +2/+1 can be a blowout, especially at instant speed. So the card is very, very good, but it's mostly good in specifically aggressive decks. So kind of drags the score down a little bit, but not much. I'll still give this a 2.5. Very solid card. I like Inspiring Captain a little bit more, though. Note how the names play on each other. Just 4 mana, and they're both, I think, older cards. I know Inspired Charge is, but Captain is a Hill Giant, 4 mana, 3/3. And again, in aggressive decks, this is a 1-turn Anthem effect that can actually be really effective on the right board. Good in the late game, but sometimes good on curve too if you're able to play creatures. So I would say that I'd give this a 3. Again, really solid bread and butter. I'm going to keep using that term over and over. Sorry about that, but just kind of one of the premier commons in white, and one of the better reasons to play an aggressive white-based strategy, whether it's white-red, white-green, whatever. Going wide with white-green, going aggressive with Boros. This is going to be a good card in either deck, so I'm a big fan of it. And, by the way, in blue-white flyers, also pretty good too, so keep that in mind. Moment of Heroism is a very good combat trick and works pretty well with the life gain strategies in the format too. Notice how many life gain cards there are in white specifically, but it won't be the only color with those. So I do like this as a combat trick, especially if you can get extra value out of it, and I'll give it a 2. Moorland Inquisitor is at least okay. You know, it's a bear, it's a filler card, it's probably just a 1.5. It's going to get cut about half the time, but again, if you're looking for a curve filler at the 2-drop slot, you could do a lot worse than Inquisitor. And I like mana sinks, even though this is incredibly steep. I like having a mana sink every now and again. Pacifism is an all-star uncommon that I'm actually going to give a 4.5, possibly even a 5. I think if there's one ridiculous card in white that has like absolutely no restrictions on playing it, like casting cost or commitment to white in terms of mana, Pacifism is probably the single best card in the entire color. Rarity aside, so I will say I'll go ahead and give it a 5. I don't know how controversial that is, but this is maybe the best removal in the entire set, especially given its rarity, and no matter how many copies of Pacifism you get, you play this card. It's just ridiculous. Raise the Alarm. I will say this is probably a solid 3.5. Allows you to go a little bit wider, works with cards that care about how many creatures you have on the battlefield. We're about to get to one in a second. And I really like this card, always have. So Raise the Alarm, very solid playable. Soul Mender. I will rate this higher than I want to and give it a 2.5, because gaining a life every turn is going to work really well with the Angel that basically makes this gain you 2 life. That's not bad. Epicure of Blood is back in this format, so this just changes into a drain every single turn if you have a Soul Mender, and multiple copies of Soul Mender looks really good in that situation. So I'll give Soul Mender a 2.5, even though I don't usually like 1-drops like this in Limited that just have the 1 power, the 1 toughness. They don't look super strong. They die to everything. You know, they can't combat at all. So I'm not a big fan of stuff like this usually, but I think with all the life gain stuff going on in the set, this does get a little bit of a bump, and I'll give it at least a, well, let me change it to a 2. Solid. You'll cut it a lot of the time, but still, if you have the right cards to play around Soul Mender, it's going to be an all-star thing. Especially if you get like 3 copies, it can be great. But Squad Captain is a card I've kind of waffled back and forth with a lot when it comes to the white cards. This is a pretty solid common, but some of the time it's just going to be like a 3/3 or a 4/4. And honestly, a 4/4 Vigilance isn't the worst price for 5 mana, but it's still not exactly where I want to be. But that said, in the late game, you drop this in a stalemate, a stall situation where you have like 4 or 5 creatures on the battlefield at least, and it's just huge. And it has Vigilance, just gets to attack consequence free. I really like this in that situation, so I'll probably give this like a 3. This probably won't get cut very often, especially if you're in the kind of aggressive or go wide deck that really wants this kind of effect. The card's just really good. As far as Steadfast Sentry, 3 mana for a 3/2 Vigilance, which is already at least okay, but the fact that it transfers one of its power when it dies, especially onto a flyer or something like that, that can be really, really good. So again, just a card that you'll probably play a lot of the time if you have nothing better to fill your curve with at 3. So I'll give this card a 2. Yoked Ox. I have a lot of affinity for this card. I've got a long and storied history with the Yoked one, but honestly, I just got to give this like a 1. It's not the best card in the world, but it will block on the ground for you if nothing else. Alright, so that's all of white, and I guess the only other thing I have to say about this is kind of to summarize the color. There's a fair amount of aggression here, but there's also the life gain sub-theme, and I sort of like the balance between those two. There's a fair amount of flying creatures. There's at least decent removal, although not as much as usual in white. We at least get a lot of it at the common level, and I really like that. Like, Pacifism makes up for the fact we don't get a lot of good removal. because it's just a ridiculous card. So I think white has a lot of offer in this set. No matter what other strategy you're playing. Again, if you're in an aggressive deck in red, a go wide strategy that includes green, a flying strategy that includes blue, or a life gain strategy that includes black or green for that matter, white is a very good supporting color, as it's usually its best role. So I actually think that white probably gets, like, again, these are just coming off the top of my head, so please don't, like, chop said head off, but I think white is one of the stronger colors in terms of just, like, what it can offer the other colors. As far as support goes. So I'd probably give white like a solid B+ in this set. I think it does a lot, but it doesn't do a whole lot in stand out. But it does, again, have a lot to offer. So let's go on to blue here and check out these crazy cards. I actually think blue is a fine color too, but I think they've done a pretty good job of balancing. So we'll get to all that a little bit later in the video. Let's go ahead and check out Moo Yanling. Now, Moo is Boo. This is a ridiculous card if you happen to get it, but I mean, that's what Mythics are supposed to do in Sealed or in Limited in general. And this does it very well. This is defensive piece for that +2s, which is very, very nice. It costs next to nothing to cast in terms of what planeswalkers usually cost. It makes creatures lose flying, which is actually really important in this limited environment, and it provides giant flyers to you, and occasionally, very occasionally, it'll give you the chance to draw like 2-3 cards a turn, and that's not bad either. So Moo is maybe one of the best cards in blue, hands down, and I'll give this a 5. This will put you in blue if you get it in your sealed, if you're sealed packs. So just a crazy card. It's one of the cards that I would look forward to opening the most in the sealed environment. As far as Cavalier, just like all the other Cavaliers, really heavy commitment to blue, but card advantage when it comes into play is really, really nice, and it's impossible to kill entirely. Not completely impossible, but very, very difficult to deal with completely. And a 5/5 flyer is just crazy stats too, so you gotta probably give this at least a 4.5. The only reason it gets a half of a point off is the commitment to blue that it requires, but I mean, brush that aside. The card is just unbelievably ridiculous in the sealed environment. It's going to win a lot of games if you actually get to play it. So, commitment to blue aside, card is unbelievable. Let's give it a 4.5. Agent of Treachery cost a ton of mana to cast, but can win you the game. It doesn't have huge stats on its own, but you don't have like Lightning Strike to worry about in this format. And there's a couple of things, like for instance, pacifism. If they pacify this, obviously it doesn't like get rid of the creature you stole. They can just pacify the creature you stole, but that doesn't get rid of Agent of Treachery. The thing that in white that destroys a tapped creature, for instance, you can just never tap your Agent of Treachery. So that's pretty cool. But even if they do kill Agent, you still get to keep the permanent that you stole. So it's worth all 7 mana, and I will probably give this like a 3. 7 mana is really, really steep and sealed. 6 mana I don't mind so much, but 7 is very difficult to get to some of the time. And I know it doesn't seem like much of a difference, but it is a huge difference. So I'll just give this a 3. I'd probably end up playing it, but there are definitely things that make me wary of it. Atemsis, All-Seeing, is 6 mana and again a extremely heavy commitment to blue, but this will win you the game some of the time when you play it, if only because it's a huge flyer. That's it. You might not ever activate its ability, and you will never, ever win the game in sealed off of the other piece of, win the game text here at the bottom. But again, achievement unlocked if you can, but it's just not going to happen. The main attraction here is that this is a 6 mana 4/5 flyer that will occasionally get you some card advantage, and that is pretty sweet. So you play the card if you get it, and you're really heavy blue. Drawn from Dreams doesn't actually look like much, especially in sealed, but 4 mana to get the best 2 cards and get closer to the bomb, almost guarantee that you draw one of the bombs that you're able to get in your sealed pool, is actually very, very good. I don't necessarily like taking off turn 4, 5, 6, whatever to play this card, but that said, it can be a pretty good top deck, and again, just getting to the best cards that you were able to open up is maybe one of the highest priorities in sealed, so the card is very good, and I will probably go ahead and give it a 3. Let's do that. And I don't know if I assigned Atemsis a rating. Oh my goodness. Let's give that a 4, mostly because, again, the commitment to blue. It could be a 4.5. Dungeon Geists is a straight 4 for me. This is a ridiculous card in every limited environment that it's involved in, which I think has only been like 1 or 2 so far. But it's just a crazy card. I like this. Like, it's almost standard playable, but not quite. 4 mana for a 3/3 flying is already at least decent stats. Not the best in the world, but decent stats. But being able to freeze down something is crazy. It's basically removal that is also a flying body, and those are both things you need in sealed. So I might bump this up to a 4.5. Just Dungeon Geist is an unbelievable card. Flood of Tears. I've been brewing with this in standard. I think it's one of the more interesting cards in the set in terms of what you can do with it when you build around it. But even if you're not building around it, this can be a really, really nice reset button. This is one of the cards that makes control at least somewhat possible, if not entirely viable, in the sealed environment. There's like a 3% chance that you can build a decent control deck. Hope I don't eat those words, but I really don't think control's that much of a thing. We're focusing more on creature interactions and such and combat. It's a very simple environment here. I don't know that control has much space in it, but this will be one of the key cards if you are able to float up a control deck, you know. So keep that in mind. I do think the card is relatively strong. Does hurt you if you're in a creature-based strategy, but can save your bacon some of the time. And obviously, if you have a decent board out, you at least get to play your card first. You don't get to play a bunch of cards, but you at least get to play a free card first, and that can be really, really nice. So I'll give Flood of Tears a 4. I think it's a fine card and almost a pseudo Wrath effect, and those are always at a premium. Leyline of Anticipation is at least okay. I think this is probably just like a 1.5 at the most. For sealed play at least. I really like the applications of the card in a format like Constructed. But in Limited, I don't think there's too many applications of this, although you can get really, really tricky with it. And if you have this out, your opponent will sweat swinging into you. So I might be sort of judging this a little bit low here, but I still don't think I'd jump over a bunch of hurdles to put this into my main deck. That said, I do see the card being somewhat powerful, so I might be wrong on that one. Masterful Replication does cost a lot of mana, but being able to put 6 power on the battlefield at instant speed, and by the way, this is a golem I didn't count when I said there were 4 golems in the format. So if you do have a Master Splicer out, this will put 8 power on the battlefield at instant speed, which can just blow people out entirely. So that's really, really cool. I like the card, even though 6 mana is kind of steep. This is effectively a flash creature, 2 creatures with flash for 6 mana. I think it's actually really strong, so I'll give this a 4. Tail's End, probably pretty bad. We'll give it a 0.5. It's most, well, I guess there are some legendaries you want to counter, but again, just sideboard right there, so we'll give it a 0.5. Ether Gust, again, sideboard, half a point. Air Elemental, it's a 5 mana 4/4 flying, but that's actually really good. Air Elemental has won like possibly more games of sealed than like almost any other creature. Like, it's in the top 50 creatures that have won sealed games. So keep that in mind. Air Elemental is actually a pretty nice body, especially in a format that'll pay you off for having flyers. So I'll give Air Elemental a solid 3.5. Like, you'll very rarely cut this card. It's a top tier uncommon in pretty much every environment that it's in. So, well, not Constructed. Limited period. Brineborn Cutthroat, pretty solid uncommon here too. Just a 2 mana 2/1 flash is a decent body that'll not only fill your curve, but function as a removal spell on the ground some of the time. And I like that. If you just get like 1 counter on it, then it's more than paid for itself. A 3 mana 3/2 is decent. You get 2 counters on it, it's amazing. You've effectively played 2 mana for a 4/3. So just a really nice card. And I'll probably give it like a 3. You'll rarely cut this, and if you're looking to fill out your curve, you can do way worse than this at 2. Captivating Gyre is probably like a 4.5. This card's crazy. I think that 6 mana cards are okay, so I tend to rate them a little bit higher than some players will. Some players are really adverse to 6 mana cards in sealed, and you don't want to play more than a few of them. So do keep that in mind. Don't stack your deck with 6 drops. But as far as 6 drops go, this is like easily one of the better ones in the format. It's not a wrath or anything, but it will very often win the game in case of a board stall. So it's just a great, again, just game winning, stale breaking card. So I love stuff like this. And again, even though it's not a wrath, it can sometimes give you more than 1 turn worth of breathing room, or just win the game outright. So I'm going to give it probably at least a 4, but maybe even, again, a 4.5 for this card. Cerulean Drake is a 2 mana 1/1 flyer, and even though it looks just like a color hosing thing, I still have to give it like a 1 or like a 1.5, because it's a 2 mana 1/1 flyer. If you have a bunch of things that pay you off for playing flyers, you'll probably play this card in your main deck, right? So at least a 1, if not a 1.5. Hardcover is a hilarious name for a card, especially given the art. So get it, books. Anyway, As far as 1-mana auras go, I want to like this more than I do. This makes the creature block really well, and then when you block, you just loot. So I want to like that an awful lot, but I for some reason don't, and I don't know if I can justify that. This seems like it should be very, very good and just get you a bunch of card selection over the course of a game. So against my gut feeling of like this card isn't as good as it looks, I'll go ahead and give it a 2.5 because I think you're going to play it most of the time. Portal of Sanctuary looks very nice to me. Again, removal at a premium. In sealed, pretty much any limited environment, removal is very important, and any creature that you play is going to have a target on its back, no matter what. So this can be really nice. Even in the aura decks, it's good. Usually cards like this wouldn't be, but this is a safe bounce for your aura guys. That's really, really nice. And if you have creatures with enter the battlefield triggers, this gets freaking unbelievable to just get a repeatable value out of and do something every single turn. It also keeps your creatures from getting removed and stuff. Just a really good card that I don't want to take off a turn to play, but once it's down and you untap with it in play, it's a crazy card. And if you play it on like turn 5 or 6, it becomes a really good value factory that also makes sure that your opponent's removal is more or less dead when they draw it, which is obviously crazy and sealed. So I'll give the card like a 3.5. I think it's actually one of the standouts. And again, all of these colored artifacts are very playable. Renowned Weaponsmith is at least okay if you have either of the other cards that it goes and sets up, but I don't think it's very good. We'll give this a 1.5. I don't think he'll play Weaponsmith too often. Maybe even a 1. Scholar of Ages is 7 whole mana, but is effectively card advantage. If you're able to get the full card advantage out of it, it's really, really good. So I do like the card, but I can't really give it more than like a 2, because 7 mana is extremely steep for an effect that's nowhere near as good as like the other 7 mana thing that steals a creature, right? So even though this can be great card advantage that gets back multiple removal spells, or maybe like the mini dig through time at the rare slot for 4 mana, that thing, that can be great, but 7 mana is just so much to consider putting in your deck. As far as Spectral Sailor, great uncommon. Again, I don't usually like 1-drops in sealed, but this thing can lead to a bunch of card advantage. I really do like mana sinks, and I love ways of like onboard ways of drawing cards in sealed too. If this does get like, you know, killed and you have 4 mana, you can just draw a card. It replaces itself if you're able to activate it even once. So there's just a lot to like about this. Late game mana sink that's great. If you play it anytime after you have 5 lands, then you'll have the 4 mana up automatically to draw a card. So much I like about this. And you can even like snipe 1 toughness flying creatures some of the time with it too. So it's kind of a removal spell. In edge sort of corner cases. So there's just so much that's good about Spectral Sailor. I like this card a lot, and I'll give it a 3.5, which is an extremely high score. But if I'm in blue, I'm probably playing this card. I think it actually, let me go back up, I think it might be one of the better cards in all of blue, period. Warden of Evocile really ties together the room as far as all of these flying strategies go, and I wish that it was an Anthem effect or something, but this will at least ramp you to a 5-mana flyer on turn 4 if you get it on curve, and sometimes you can even get multiple copies of this in your deck. Just a really good card. So you'll play this regardless of whether you have a bunch of flyers, because again, just Windrake stats. 3 mana 2/2 flyers, at least playable, and it's almost always going to make the cut. But if you have more flyers, it somehow gets even better. So, and there's a lot of Windrake-y creatures with extra effects in this format that are like that. And Warden is one of the better ones, provided that you can support it with other flyers. So, I'll go ahead and give this a 3, possibly a 3.5. I'll say a 3. Just solid playable, will very, very rarely get cut. Wave Crasher, the Yarix Wave Crasher specifically, is a 4-mana 4/4, so it's pretty good. It just is. And you can repeat enter the battlefield triggers and stuff, but at the same time, you play this on curve in sealed, I'm not sure that you're actually, like, you're sort of de-tempoing yourself. That kind of hit the tempo kind of sucks in sealed, so I'm not actually a huge fan of the card, but you are getting a really serviceable body that will occasionally give you a chance to, you know, get more value off of an ETB trigger. So I will say for that reason, I'll give the card like a 2, because I think it will make the cut some of the time. I really wish that it flied, but that's way too much to ask for an uncommon 4-mana 4/4 to fly, so just a little bit spoiled, I guess. But I want the card to be a half a step better, and it's not. So we'll give it a 2. You will play it some of the time. Anticipate, another bread and butter common for this color pie, at least, you know, this part of the color pie, is a playable card. In most cases, if you're playing super aggressive, you probably don't want this, but even in the flying decks, you'll probably play this just to help you get another flyer or a payoff for playing flyers. So I do like Anticipate. I would play 1 copy of it in my sealed deck if I was in blue most of the time. So I'll go ahead and give this a 2, 2.5. That's two. Solid playable. Befuddle, I have never been a huge fan of. This is tempo, and it draws a card so it at least replaces itself. That's all good, but it's just a one-time combat trick that doesn't even fog the entire board as one creature, and I've just never been a huge fan of this. Some people are, but I'm just going to give it like a 0.5. I've never been a huge fan of Befuddle. Drawing a card is nice, and you can sometimes just cycle it for 3 mana, so it's never dead, but there's almost always better things to put in your deck than Befuddle. Not always, but almost always. So I'm just not as high on the card as a lot of other people are. Bone to Ash, I'm a little bit higher on than some people are. I think 4 mana is really steep for an Essence Scatter, but again, drawing a card makes a card a lot better. So I'll give this a 1. I have been known to play Bone to Ash on more than one occasion, actually, in pre-release events, and the card pays off, especially in formats like this where like everyone's just looking to play their 5-6 mana bomb stupid creature that wins the game. Something like Bone to Ash can be really, really good, even for a relatively steep price. Boreal Elemental is a beater. 5 mana, 3/4 flyer. Already at least decent stats. I'd like it to be a little bit higher on the power end, but still serviceable stats. And it makes up for its lack of power by being really difficult to target. That's a really nice ability in Sealed, especially, where again removal is everything. Removal is king and queen and jack. So you gotta play Boreal Elemental. It's amazing this is at the common slot. I'll give this a 3.5. I think it's one of the stronger commons in the set, but it's right next to Cloudkin Seer, which is crazy. Not quite Windrake stats, but about as close as it gets. 3 mana, 2/1 flyer, draw a card. That's crazy. This is maybe the single best common in all of blue. So I'll give this a 4. Maybe it could be a 4.5. I mean, I'm always like within half a point, right? I'm saying that a lot in blue. It's really difficult to judge some of these, but again, just one of the best commons in blue. You got to give it at least a 4 because you'll play every single copy that you get. This is another one. You get 5 copies, play them all. Convolute is the closest thing to a good counterspell in this entire environment. It's crazy that in a core set they didn't like reprint Cancel or anything, but this is what I mean when I don't think like when I say I don't think Control is like a real deck in this sealed environment. There's just like a 5% chance at the most you'll be able to build it, but Convolute is a cancel most of the time, and it's at least a much more splashable cancel, so that's kind of neat. I'll give the card a 1.5 because there are decks you'll play it in. Fairy Miscreant is one of those 1-drops that I'm not a huge fan of. This does fly, pays you off for those strategies. Flying Min is not the worst card in the world, obviously, so I'll give the card a 1.5. You'll play it some of the time, but 1-drops are not the best thing in the world, even if they do fly in sealed, and it's very unlikely that you'll actually ever be able to proc this ability, so not a huge fan. You'll play it some of the time. 1. Fortress Crab, I like way more than I should. This is a 4 mana 1/6, and that's all it does. I actually kind of really like that. This holds down the ground all day, and you know, like 5 mana 2/5s have gotten praise in prior limited environments, so yeah, 4 mana 1/6, this just blocks like everything that doesn't fly. So I'm actually kind of a fan in these kind of slow roll decks that are looking to put together a mid or late game plan. I actually think this is actually a pretty nice piece that I'll play more often than I would have originally thought. So I'll give this a solid 2. It's playable on more than just occasion. But Frilled Sea Serpent, I really like. I've always liked Frilled Sea Serpent. We haven't seen it too much or anything, but this has actually been a pretty bomb card when we have had the chance to play it in prior sealed environments. I don't see that changing. Again, don't play all the 6-drops in your deck, but a 4/6 with a activated ability that occasionally just wins you the game if your opponent can't deal with it is actually insane. So I'll give this a 3. Again, the casting cost hurts it, the cost of the activated ability hurts it, but it's still one of those things that, like, it's just a crazy creature that will win you the game sort of unfairly some of the time, so at least a 3. Maybe, well, 2. Let's bring it down. Let's bring it down, 2.5, but I'm still going to play this card more often than not because I have a special affinity for it. That doesn't mean you should play it. Frostlinks, big fan of this too. I like Water Trap Weavers and cards like this in any sealed environment, and even though this doesn't kill a creature forever or anything, this is a really nice piece, especially for aggressive decks, and you might even consider this in the flying deck if you're trying to fill out your 3-drop slot. So big fan of this. Tapping down another flyer, letting your flyers through for a turn, always important, but even if you're just doing that same thing but on the ground, also good. So big fan of Frostlinks. Brings a body while also having a pretty good effect. I'll give this a 2.5. Metropolis Sprite, this a little bit better than it looks just because of the flying synergy and stuff. Like, note how many flying creatures are at lower rarities in blue. It's insane. And white, for that matter. But Metropolis Sprite is another one of those cards that you'll play more often than not, but it's not insanely powerful. If you can find a way to boost its toughness, it gets way, way better. So do keep that in mind, but that's not going to happen all the time. This does go fairly well, at least with a few of the auras in the format, but I'm still not going to score it at more than a 2. You will play it a lot of the time, though. It's a pretty good curve filler for 2 mana. Mo Piranhas is 2, though. This is going to hold down the fort for you on the ground some of the time. And a 2 mana 3/3 is always good. You can't attack with it, but if you're in a more defensive deck, this is definitely something you want in the 2-drop slot. So I'll just give it a 1 because it's going to see play in some decks. Negate, probably just a sideboard card. We'll give it the 0.5, even though it's a spectacular card. I shouldn't have to tell you that. Negate's very good. But in Sealed, this will very rarely make the main deck because it's mostly about creatures. This can protect your creatures from removal a lot of the time. So, and you know your opponent's playing removal, so you might want to play Negate in the main, but I don't think it's worth it. Do bring this in if your opponent is incredibly heavy on removal or has planeswalkers that you want to take care of while they're on the stack. Octoprophet is just okay. 4 mana 3/3 Hill Giant stats. Scribe 2, so it's like a fat Omen speaker, and that's actually okay, but it's not like huge, so I'll just give this like a 1.5. You'll play it some of the time, but not all the time. Sage's Road Denizen, there's like almost no mill support in this entire set, so I'm just going to give this like a 0.5. Not even really a good curve filler, it's just okay. Sleep Paralysis is premium removal in blue, and I love the flavor on this too. It's just delicious, but you know, I think that it's a really cool concept to build a card around. But flavor aside, 4 mana is not too much to ask for this effect, even though it looks like it. It's just unconditional removal in Sealed that your opponent probably doesn't have a main deck answer for in game 1, so just free remove that guy for the most part. Even though it is kind of a 4 mana pacifism, I still like it because I like pacifism so much. So I'll give this a 4. You'll play it pretty much every time. Unsummon, not the best card in Seal, but this does have plenty of effects. Bounces the creature for a turn, gets your guys through, keeps that huge dude from attacking, lets you repeat an enter the battlefield trigger, saves a guy from removal. You'll play this some of the time, so I'll give it a 2. Winged Words, in the flying decks, this is just unbelievable, and just gets like a 4.5. Like easily, if not a 5. It's just one of the most standout blue commons. Period. Just a ridiculous thing. Even if you don't currently have a flyer out, it's just a divination, and divination is good in Sealed too. So I guess I'll give it a 4, just because there will be times you don't have flyers and it's just divination. But anytime you have a single flyer out, the card is crazy for 2 mana, and you'll definitely play pretty much every copy you get, especially if you get a couple of flyers, and that will not be hard to do in this Seal with like 40 flyers. So, especially if you have a Zephyr Charge, another one of the craziest uncommons in blue, as if most of the creatures in the freaking set didn't have flying already. Just for any creature with FOMO, feeling of missing out, fear of missing out. And this will, hey, invite them to the party too, Bubba. You can come in. Anybody can fly. I believe you can fly. It's just a crazy mana sink that, you windmill slam it late in the game and start giving like 2 creatures flying that same turn. It's just really, really good. And I think that at least the 1 copy, if not 2, can make a fair amount of Sealed decks. Just a really big fan of the card. I think it's an easy standout common in blue. And I'll go ahead and give it a 4. You're going to play it. You're going to play it. But as far as blue overall, like as a strategy, I think there's obviously a lot of strong stuff here that I pointed out. And it would be really tough to give you like a top 3 or 4, commons and uncommons in blue, because there's a lot of good stuff here. But again, kind of a support color overall. But blue-white flyers is a very real deck. Most of the good payoffs for playing flying creatures are going to be in blue, especially Winged Words. There is a decent removal piece in Sleep Paralysis. Zephyr Charge is an unbelievable card. Some of the uncommons are very nice in blue, like Portal of Sanctuary is pretty good. Spectral Sailor, a very good uncommon. Captivating Gyre, ridiculous. Air Elemental wins a lot of games. And as far as the rares go, there's not a whole lot, but things like, Flood of Tears, Dungeon Geist, Yanling, one of the best cards for Sealed in the entire set. Cavalier, Agent, it's just like the value goes on in blue, and there are lots of cards here that can win you the game by themselves. So I got to give blue an A here, and I don't usually do that. Sealed is kind of not often the format for blue, but there's just so much value here in terms of what you can do with these blue cards. So many good flyers, a lot of decent card draw, and even though the counters aren't as represented, the sort of control aspect of playing blue isn't as represented, that means that they've juiced the power level of some of these creatures and such in blue, and I am all in for that. Blue is a pretty good color this time. All right, on to the black cards. I really do like black in this sealed environment, so let's go ahead and start with Sorin, who is not total garbage. It turns out there are more vampires. Well, actually, vampires are the second most supported tribe in sealed. There are 8 of them, and most of them are at the lower rarities. So there's going to be the odd time where Sorin just works with a vampire that you've gotten in your sealed pool. But do note, this just can give Death Touch and Lifelink to any old creature with the +1, and that's actually very good to do once a turn. That's actually pretty good, even if you have Vampire 0 in your deck. So I would actually maybe play a 1 copy of Sorin if I got a copy of Sorin. If I was in an aggressive enough deck, or a deck that wanted life gain synergies, by the way, keep that in mind. And Death Touch is nothing to sneeze at in sealed either, obviously. So actually, even if you don't have vampires, it's a fine card, right? Just gives you this ability once a turn at the cost of nothing. So I actually kind of like it, and I'll give it a 3.5. If you have, say, 4 or 5 vampires in your deck, that probably goes up to a 4. But this is actually kind of a sleeper for sealed because this first ability is good even if you don't have vampires, and the cost on it is not too steep, and it's relatively splashable. As far as Cavalier of Night, this is probably my favorite Cavalier for sealed play, I think. I don't necessarily like having to sacrifice another creature, but when you do, you just get a removal, an unconditional removal piece. That's obviously really good. And if they ever actually do deal with Cavalier of Night, if they deal with your 4/5 lifelink, then they're not done. You still get a card back, probably the thing you sacrificed to begin with. So, card is just never-ending value, and the moment that you play it, your opponent is dealing with it for the next few turns. Even if they kill it, they're still dealing with it. Immediate impact on the battlefield does the thing you want it to do. So even with the high commitment to black, every Cavalier is going to bring that commitment to a color. I still think that this is an incredible card, and I'll give it a 4.5. It's just insane. It might be the best of the Cavalier cycle, and it could even deserve a 5. This is a ridiculous card, but Dread Presence, one of sort of my favorite cards, even though I don't think it's like amazing and constructed play or anything. It's just kind of one of my favorite cards on a personal level in the entire set, and I think it's actually pretty decent for sealed, although not incredible. A 4-mana 3/3 isn't the best stats in the world, and you won't have as many lands in your deck as you do in constructed, let alone as many swamps as you could have in a constructed deck. So most of the time you're not playing mono black or anything, so that kind of hurts the card a little bit. But if you get 1 swamp while you have this out, it's at least replaced itself, draws you a card, or it can kill a thing, and that's, removal, repeatable removal on a stick is good. That's very good. So I think the card definitely has its place, but there's no guarantee you're ever going to get any value out of it in a given game. I do think that hurts its score a little bit, so I'll give it a 3 in the sealed environment. You'll probably play it every time, though. Embodiment of Agonies is crazy. It's just it's just so crazy. I will say that this will very likely not be playable on curve for you, unless you've been able to get 1 or 2 cards in the graveyard, but then it's not that great, right? This is actually much better off the top of your deck on turn 7 or 8, 9, very late in the game, when you have 3, 4 creatures in the graveyard. That's when this card really shines. So, again, I don't think that it plays well on curve, and that does hurt the score. So I'm just going to give this one a 3-2 as well, but 3-2 as well, just a 3. For this one, but that doesn't mean it's a bad card. Remember that 3 means that it very, very rarely gets cut. You'll play the card pretty much every time that you get it, but it's not great on turn 3. But off the top of your deck, it's ridiculous. Knight of the Ebon Legion. I think this is a playable 1-drop in Seal, which I won't say about every 1-drop, trust me. This has a very good mana sink on it, decent activated ability that makes it one of the bigger creatures in your deck most of the time, and it can get +1/+1 counters. The more counters it gets, the more your opponent's losing the game, because they keep losing 4 life. And do note that even if you lose the 4 life, this gets a counter too, so it can have the potential of catching you up from behind by getting a little bit bigger after a combat step where you lost some life. So that's not bad. Maybe the next turn your opponent won't be able to attack so heavily into you if this got a counter. So I kind of like that. De-incentivizes the opponent from attacking you for too much damage all at once. So that's not so bad. So I will give this card, I'd say at least, I'll give it a 3. I'll give it a 3 because you'll play the card. Which you can't say about every 1-drop. A mana sink like this is incredibly desirable, and even if it doesn't necessarily get enough power to kill the creature that it's blocking or whatever after you activate its ability, it will have Death Touch too, so it just kills everything on the ground. I like that. Legion's End, premium removal. Even though it only hits things that cost 2 mana or less, everyone plays creatures 2 mana or less in the sealed environment. It's pretty much, it's not entirely universal, but especially in a format where control was not as heavily supported and it didn't really get many counter spells or mass removal of any kind. A lot more people are going to be on smaller creatures on turn 2, and Legion's End is going to actually be pretty decent. Even though you won't get extra value out of it, it's still removal. It'll almost always find a target. I give it a 3. Ley Line of the Void is fairly bad. We'll give it a 0. I think it's more or less unplayable. Rotting Regisaur, discarding a card every turn is bad. That's fairly bad, but this is a body that if you get it on turn 3, they have to remove it or they lose. They have to remove it or they will just lose a creature every turn and eventually lose the game to a card like this. Even if they're able to like mount some sort of defense, they have, this is a must kill or they're just done after a certain amount of time. If again you get this on curve. Note though that if you top deck this in the late game, it doesn't like sacrifice if you can't discard the card. So just if you have no cards in your hand, there's no detriment to having this card whatsoever. So it's fine when you top deck it too. So I'll give this one like a 4, possibly. It gets way better the earlier in the game you play it, but if you play it on turn 3 and the opponent doesn't have removal, it's really going to be difficult to answer this card. So huge fan. It almost always will get double blocked at the very least. So good, very good card here. Scheming Symmetry is not great in sealed. Really big fan of this card in constructed, and I think there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with it. Just a 1-mana tutor is good, and a 1-mana tutor is good too in sealed. I bet you that my super crazy bomb in my sealed pool is better than your super crazy bomb in your sealed pool. Is what you're doing when you cast this card, but I still don't think it's that great. Probably just a 1 at the most. Again, if you get some of the best cards in the entire set, then maybe you'll take the chance, but I doubt it most of the time. Villas, Broker of Blood, is an extremely heavy commitment to black and extremely high casting cost. Although if you do get the card onto the battlefield, you win. You just pretty much win the game. So card is good, don't get me wrong, but I still think that's incredibly steep. So I'm gonna go ahead and give this like a 4, well, 3.5. Let's bump it down to 3.5, just because it's so impossibly hard to actually play. But that said, the games where you do get this on the battlefield, it's just the best creature in the set, hands down. So while it's on the battlefield, best creature in the set. While it's in your hand, one of the worst, because it's gonna be really hard to get to. But let's do Blight Beetle. This is just like a 0.5, I guess. This will come in against green decks sometimes, I guess. But aside from that, it's a pretty poor card. Blood for Bones, one of the better uncommons in the set. Black got some really, really good uncommons this time around. It's where most of the value in the color is. And Blood for Bones is easily one of the better cards. Because it's just value, even if you're not recurring something really big, you're also not really sacrificing a creature to do this. And you might be able to like repeat 2 into the battlefield triggers at the height of its value. Like the ceiling on the card is incredibly high. But even at its floor, it's a pretty fine card. I think it's one of the premier uncommons in the sealed environment, period. So I'll give this card a 4. I don't really think there's hardly any opportunity cost to playing this card at all. And at the very least, it's card selection out of your graveyard. Again, at its floor. So I like the card a lot. Blood-Soaked Altar, gonna win you a game here and there. 6 mana, again, pretty steep here, but just being able to make 5/5s, turn dead draws and bad creatures into 5/5 flyers is just insane. And activating this like twice in a game probably wins you that game if your life total wasn't that high or wasn't that low. So I think this is actually probably like a 4. It's just like an uncommon that wins you the game. So this is at least a 4, if not a 4.5. It's a standout. Bloodthirsty Aerialist, another kind of standout and probably the single best payoff for life gain in this whole set, and there's a ton of life gain in this set, so huge fan of this. A little bit difficult to cast, but like not too much that you don't put it in your deck. This is probably a 3.5 and possibly even a 4. Again, just one of the standout uncommons in the whole set, and black has a ton of them in general, but especially if you're able to support this, it just becomes crazy. But the stats are at least okay even if you can't support it, so it's a fine card. Disfigure is probably a 3.5. Just 1 mana for this effect is very, very good, especially at instant speed. Do not discount how good this is. A lot of people would probably tend to, especially newer players, look at Disfigure and they're like, it's not that great. Nope, it's removal. It's a shock. You put it in your deck, you play it in sealed. Gravedigger, another card that you play in sealed pretty much every time. This is probably also like a 3.5. You will very, very rarely cut Gravedigger, and it's just value. 4 mana 2/2 puts a body on the battlefield and gets something out of your graveyard is basically draw a card from your graveyard. Just select a card to draw from your graveyard, and that's just insane. In pretty much every sealed environment you can play Gravedigger, you play Gravedigger. 3.5 easy. Gruesome Scourger, I want to say Scrounger. Gruesome Scourger is not actually that great. You know, a lot of the time you'll play this, and even at the height, at its ceiling, you'll probably have like 4 other creatures out. And that's not as good as it sounds. Like, it's trying to do sort of a Grey Merchant of Asphodel impression, but it's not doing it at all. It's failing super hard. So I'll probably just give this card like a 2. You won't play it every time, but again, in decks where you like your whole thing is to go wide, it could finish a game off for you here and there. So I'm not saying the card's bad, but 2 is probably what we're looking at here. Maybe 1.5 even. Noxious Grasp, sideboard material, but very good sideboard material. Still, just a 0.5 point. Thought Distortion, okay. You know, 6 mana is really steep, and if I'm looking to play 6 mana cards, you probably could do better in your sealed pool. But at the same time, this can just make them discard like a bunch of cards. But again, with control not being much of a thing and sealed being a format that mostly rotates around value creatures and removal, I don't think the card is that good. You can make them discard removal, but I still think the card isn't more than like a 1, to be honest. I'm looking to play better stuff than this a lot of the time. Undead Servant is bad just because you're not going to get a bunch of these. If you do get a bunch of them, the card gets way better, but it's probably not, and the stats are bad to begin with, so I'll just give this a 1. Fill a creature at the very most. Vampire of the Dire Moon, however, pretty sweet. Pretty sweet. I like 1 mana 1/1 death touches as a matter of course, and this also has lifelink, so it helps you get a little bit deeper in the game. I like that about it too. And there's a bunch of auras, as already discussed. If you give this flying or make it any bigger, it's a really imposing creature, and I'd play it almost every time, so I'll give this at least a 2.5. Really, my score is like a 3.5 because I really, really like 1 mana death touchers and sealed. They're almost unfair, but the card is realistically probably closer to a 2, 2.5. Vengeful Warchief is a pretty WoW card, not only because it looks like a character from WoW, a game I have not played even once in my entire life, but I can identify a WoW character when I see one. It's, honestly, 5 mana for a 4/4 is at least a decent deal, and this could like deter your opponent from attacking you. You know, it's really not bad at all. I like a lot about this. If you lose life like once or twice, then it becomes like a 5/5, a 6/6, and that's just crazy. So I actually kind of dig this card a lot, and I'll give it a 3. Just as a baseline score, because I think you'll probably play this and not cut it most of the time. Especially for just trying to top your curve, pretty fine thing. Yarok's Finlurker is a fairly heavy commitment to black if you want to get it on curve, but I do really like this card. I've always liked fire breathing or shade effects in limited, especially just because, again, I like mana sinks. I like the ability to pump my creatures in combat because combat is so important in sealed, especially in a core set sealed environment where things are a little bit stripped down, a lot more simple, brought down to the base elements. Cards like this with this kind of fire breathing ability can be really, really good in the late game. And the fact that they exile a card from their hand is much better than Burglar Rats. And Burglar Rats is a card I'll usually play in sealed, so I'll give this a tentative 2.5. Because, again, I think the commitment to black is extremely high if you want to play this on turn 2. That kind of turns me off a little bit, but I do like a lot about the card. Agonizing Siphon is up next, and this is removal that you'll prioritize. You know, this 4 mana is kind of high for something like this, for basically a Lightning Helix. 4 mana Lightning Helix is a lot, but you'll still play it every single time, so I'll give it a 3.5. It can get you right back in the game and take one of the biggest threats off the other side of the table. Audacious Thief is maybe possibly the best black common. As far as commons go, this is everything you want. It's not quite like a Phyrexian Rager or anything. You're not guaranteed to ever get the value out of it. Might get removed, but it's a pretty high priority removal target. Usually not a big fan of 3 mana 2/2s, but drawing cards is like the best thing you can do. You know? So this is probably one of the premier commons in black, and I'll give it a 3.5. Barony Vampire, filler, it's 1, I guess. Bladebrand, always a better card than you think it is. Bladebrand got a fair amount of attention in the last sealed environment we could play it in. It's because it was probably one of the better combat tricks in the whole format. I wouldn't rate the card super high, but don't take it for granted either, or don't like laugh at it. Bladebrand is actually a pretty effective card for making smaller creatures trade up with huge bombs and still get you, you know, up in that exchange, or at least even in that exchange. So it's a great card, but it's still just a combat trick. It's probably not more than a 1.5. But I just wanted to give Blade Brand a little bit of due because it's actually a better card than it looks like. Blood Burglar 2. It doesn't compare well to things like Bishop Soldier, but Bishop Soldier isn't in this format. And if you want a 2-mana lifelinker, this is as good as you're going to get. You know, it's not quite Child of Night either, but it's still fine. Doesn't block as well as most creatures with lifelink, but attacks very well, and you might get a bit of vampire synergy out of it too. So there's that. Bone Splinters, you'll play pretty much every time. Did I give Blood Burglar a rating? 2.5. 2. Well, we'll call it a 2. Bone Splinters. This is always tough to rate. Honestly, you must sacrifice a creature to it, and there aren't really that many payoffs for doing so in this environment at the very least. But it is still removal for just 1 mana that'll sometimes completely blow them out of the bomb that they were super excited about getting to play. It's a really mean card, so we'll give it a 3.5. You'll play it pretty much every time. Boneclad Necromancer is a 5 mana card that effectively gets you 5 power on the battlefield. And that's okay. You know, 5 mana, 3/3 amass 2 is at least okay. So I'll probably, even though both creatures are completely vanilla, you know, so it's not amazing. So I'll give it like a 2. I was going to go down to 1.5. I'll leave it at a 2. You'll probably play this some of the, no, 1.5. Let's do 1.5 because it will get cut some of the time. Duress, 0.5 sideboard card. Epicure Blood gets much better with these life gain decks. You know, again, this is another one of, you know, Black has all the best life gain payoffs, and this is another one of them, especially at the common level. Just unbelievable this card still exists. So I love Epicure. It's one of my favorite cards of recent years at the common level. And I've always loved playing with this. So I will give, my personal score is like a 4, but the more realistic score is probably closer to a 2.5. This will make the cut most of the time. Fathom Fleet Cutthroat can be a really tricky card, and sometimes your opponent will end up losing a creature to it that they really didn't expect to lose. So I've always been a fan of this card too in the sealed environment. I'll say we'll give this a 3. It's going to make the cut most of the time too, and it effectively counts as removal, so you prioritize it. Feral Abomination is a 6 mana 5/5 Death Touch, and that's all it needs to be. 6 mana again steep, but it is splashable. And even though the Death Touch is a little bit superfluous, you know, it's a 5/5, so most of the time it won't need the Death Touch, but still, it's one of the bigger creatures at the common level in the entire sealed environment, so we'll make the cut some of the time. I'll give it a 1. Gorging Vulture, my exclusive preview card. This also has Windrake stats and does more stuff. It works pretty well in the life gain decks. Works pretty good if you're playing like Blood for Bones or anything. Gravedigger, cards that get stuff back from your graveyard. It can be a pretty decent thing. So I'll give my preview card a 2.5. You're going to play it most of the time. And Windrakes are just always playable, period. Mind Rot, always better than it looks in sealed. We'll give it a 2. Murder, ridiculous. We'll give it a 4. Just one of the best cards you could possibly be playing. Sanitarium Skeleton, pretty decent 1-drops. 1-drops in the set are actually all, well, at least okay for sealed play. I'll give Wizards that. They actually did a pretty good job with the 1-drops for the pre-release. Sanitarium Skeleton, I guess we'll give like a 1-2. It's okay. Not a 1-2, just a 1. But Sorcerer of the Fang, I actually like this a good bit, but not like all the way. Let's give it a 1 because this will make the cut some of the time if you're looking to fill out your curve, and it's great in the late game for like providing reach, but it's never as good as it looks. Soul Salvage, on the other hand, always better than it looks. This is just card advantage out of your graveyard, and that's great. Get you back the 2 best creatures from your graveyard, and that's always good. Soul Salvage is really, really good. In sealed, play this card. It's like a 3 at the very least. Card advantage is good. Play it. Unholy Indenture. Cost a little bit too much mana for this kind of effect, and this effect keeps getting like more and more expensive as time goes on. I don't like that. But it does give the creature like Undying, and that's great. You're paying 3 mana for Undying, and that could be awesome. So I actually think the card has its applications, and there's been more than one creature that I've been like, oh, this could be good with auras. This fits on all of those, but it also just fits well on creatures with ETB triggers, and even just flyers. This fits pretty well on, so I don't think you'll play it in every sealed deck, but you will play it in some, so I'll give it a 1.5. Overall, I think that Black is, like I said, a strong color, but there are some misses here, but the hits are really high. And that's because Black has a lot of like really good, you know, fat flying creatures, like just like Blue and White did, but also has like more in the removal department than a lot of these other colors do, as it usually does. So I also like the way that Black handles itself on the ground at the lower rarity, so keep that in mind. I think there's a lot to like about Black in this set too, and I'll give it an A. But we are on to red, if you didn't notice the change of screen there. First of all, Chandra, this is a 5. You know, again, 6-mana cards, ridiculous, but this is the best 6-mana card in the entire set, bar none, more or less, period. This just wins you the game in multiple ways. It's kind of a board wipe, too. It's just crazy. This is a good card. Play it every time. It's a 5. Cavalier of Flame, also okay, but not necessarily the best Cavalier. Especially in sealed, where you're not that likely to have a ton of land cards in your graveyard, so even the dice trigger that would normally be really good is not great. Like, one of the best things about this is the just the stats. A 5-mana 6/5. That's pretty raw, and the fact that this can go really, really well, especially like you untap with it on the next turn, you have all your mana available to you. This this fire breathing ability for creatures you control is just like crazy, so it's not a bad card at all. I just don't think it's the best of the Cavalier cycle by any means. Most of the other ones we've already discussed are better than this, but I'll still give it a 4 because the stats are raw, and again, if you untap with it, it's crazy. Chandra Acolyte of Flame, Baby Chandra, is also pretty decent, but not incredible. This is at least a creature factory, and sometimes will let you recast removal and stuff, and that's not bad, but at the same time, it doesn't plus that often, you know, like it'll plus sometimes, but if it pluses, it doesn't do anything but plus. So I'm not a huge fan of that, even though it is really cheap to cast, and I do like that about it. So there's a little bit of ambivalence here to this card, but I still think you'll play it a lot of the time, especially if you're able to get a fair amount of desirable removal in your sealed pool. So I'm going to give it a tentative 4. I'm going to use that word tentative a good amount, but I still think you probably play this every single time you get it, so at least a 4. Chandra's Regulator, pretty sweet card. This just fixes your draws in red, which is one of the only things that red really needed to dominate in the sealed environment in this set. It's got a lot of removal, a lot of good creatures, but it doesn't fly anywhere near as well as the other colors, as usual. You wouldn't really be worried about that. It also doesn't have as much really good burn, but it still has a fair amount of removal. So, but we'll get to all that when I break down the color. Just one of the things that the color really needed was good ways to fix its draws, and if you get a Chandra's Regulator, well, you've more or less just done that. There's a little bit of restriction on the card, though. You can only discard mountains or red cards, so you won't be able to fix every single draw in a multicolor deck. That can sometimes drag the card down, but I'll still give it a pretty solid 3.5 here because I want to play it pretty much every time I get it, especially if I've heavily prioritized red. Drakuseth, another reason to do just that, by the way, but still 7 mana. If you're able to play the card, it's a ridiculous bomb that'll win you the game if it's able to attack, especially because it just like wipes everything out if it's able to attack. You play it when you get it and it pushes you into red, but again, the commitment to red is very, very heavy. But that said, I think that if you're committed to red, it's a better, you know, red commitment card than Cavalier is, even in red. So if it hits the battlefield and survives the turn, it'll almost always result in you winning the game. So I'll give this a 4. And the only reason I don't give it a 4.5 is because of the red commitment and the ridiculous casting cost. But it's still a great card, so at least a 4. Gilthorn Buccaneer, or Glinthorn Buccaneer, is also a solid creature. The stats are on point. 3 mana, 2/4 haste is at least a pretty good deal. And the ability to not only grant you reach, but also fix your draws is crazy all on one creature. I'm giving this a 4 in the sealed environment too, because it just does so much for you on a stick and has decent stats. Attacks well, blocks well, lot to like about this card. Leyline of Combustion is 0. It's probably unplayable. Yeah, probably. Yes. Okay, Marauding Raptor. I had to think about it for a second. Yeah, don't play it. Marauding Raptor is actually not bad in terms of stats alone. A 3 mana 2/3 is good, but this will shut you out of playing most other creatures in the format, and I don't like that at all. If you're looking to play dinosaurs, there are a whole 5 of them in the limited environment, and 3 of those are rare, so good luck getting all of them in your sealed pool. So I'm not a huge fan of this, even though it kind of looks tempting. I'll still just give this like a 1, or maybe even like a 0.5, because this locking you out of playing a bunch of creatures in the environment is just not good. That's bad. Repeated Reverberation is good in the late game if you're pairing it with a removal spell, but or like a Planeswalker ability, yeah, but I still think the card mostly sits dead in your hand for a lot of the game, and although, again, you can blow them out with removal in the late game, it's still not great, and it costs you like a couple of cards to do that. Festers in your hand for like 7 turns. Just think it's kind of a trap, and it's probably a 0.5 for me. Thunderkin Awakener. Let's talk about elementals. We finally get to like really, really do that. And we've already passed some elementals, but this is the first one with elemental synergy. There are 31 elementals in this set, and 22 of them are at the common and uncommon level. So there are a ton of there's so much support for elemental tribal, and this is one of the cards that pays it off. It's actually a pretty good rare. It usually only attacks like once, and I don't like that about it. And the card that it gets back doesn't survive for the entire turn. But this can sometimes, especially with the haste, be a really good top deck. It just gives you these crazy attacks out of nowhere, swing the game. So those times will be probably few and far between. But I still think the card has plenty of applications, and it's probably worth at least a 2 because it can be a decent curve filler if nothing else, and it has haste for the aggressive decks if you cast it on turn 2. Doesn't do too much damage, but still has the haste if nothing else. Chandra Novice Pyromancer is probably a 3.5. Again, with so much elemental tribal support, that first ability is actually pretty good. She can also ramp you, nothing wrong with that, get you to all those premium 6 drops, or even a 7 drop on the next turn, possibly. There's a lot of good 7 drops. You want to play Drakusith? Get a Chandra Novice Pyromancer. That's really good ramp. And then finally, the shock ability is just unbelievable. The ability to maybe take out a couple of things, and if you +1 it, up to 3 creatures, is just unbelievable. This is one of the better uncommons in the entire set. I'm giving it a 4.5. I would play this card, especially if you have like 6+ elementals in your deck. The card is unbelievable. Just play it. Chandra Spitfire, a little bit better than it looks. A 3-mana 1/3 flyer, not the best stats in the world, but it does fly, and there's not a whole lot of flying payoff in red, for the most part at least, and this will at least block other flyers in the blue-white flyers deck coming at you from the other side of the table. So there are things I like about this, and there are ways, we just looked at Chandra, there are ways to deal non-combat damage in this format. Not a ton, but some. And so I do think that sometimes you'll be able to get this to a 4 power flyer and go ahead and get in, but not a ton of the time. So I'm just going to go ahead and give this a solid 2. You'll probably play it just because it's a flying creature with at least a decent toughness that blocks okay for its casting cost. So it probably makes the cut, but it's not the best card in the world. But again, you'll probably play it. Dragon Mage costs 7 freaking mana, but it's a 5 mana for it's a 5/5 flyer. And it just makes everybody wheel. Like, it's a really ridiculous card when it does hit for combat damage, and it probably wins the game just in terms of stats. But still, 7 mana is really a lot. That is so much. So I'm just gonna give the card a 2.5. I think, well, let's say 2. Let's say 2. It won't always make the cut depending on what else you've got at 7 mana, or if you even want to play a 7 mana card to begin with. If you're really aggressive, you probably don't. So I can't give this card too much higher than a 2. Ember Hauler, pretty good card here. 2 mana 2/2 and just shocks things. That's a way to get Chandra Spitfire going, right? But at the same time, this requires a pretty heavy commitment to play on curve to red mana, and I'm not sure I like that. I already said that about like Finlurker in black, for instance, and I think that applies here too. But at the same time, Ember Hauler won't put you in red if it's in your sealed pool, but it's still a great card if you're in red, and you'll play it every time if you are playing red. Even if you have to wait until turn 4 or 5 to play it and get that second red source, you still do it. So Ember Hauler is probably a solid 3 for me. Flame Sweep is one of the rare sweepers. I mean, it's aptly named. It's one of the rare sweepers in this limited environment, and I actually think it's definitely main deck playable, especially in the flying deck. This is a good reason to go, you know, white-red flyers or blue-red flyers, is to get Flame Sweep. You might even go Jeskai flyers just to splash this card. So Flame Sweep is definitely playable in those decks, but it's playable in decks, period, especially decks that aren't looking to play aggressive. So do like the card. We'll give it a 3. Fry. Philip J here is a sideboard card, so we'll just give it a half a point. Goblin Ringleader probably won't get you goblins. I mean, there are some in the set, but I guess if you net 1 goblin off of this, it's done its job. But the grade is very variable here, and I'll probably just give this like a 1. It's not even a great filler creature. Mask of Immolation is maybe my favorite of these colored artifacts. I think this card is really good. 2 mana for one of these living equipments is really nice. It's just giving you a 1/1, but that's okay. The ability to give any and all of your creatures, you know, the chance to sacrifice for damage, I cannot overstate how good that is and how much better than it looks. Now you don't want, hey Ziggy, now you don't want to sacrifice your creatures willy-nilly, but once you get into a position where this is effectively reach and just deals an extra 3 or 4 damage over the course of a couple of turns, that can be really, really good if you need to bolt your opponent FTW, or if your opponent has some 1 toughness guys you want to kill. This can be a really good card too. I think there's a lot of stretch on it. Even though it's not the best card, it's maybe not even the best uncommon in red, it's still a good card to watch out for, and I do like a lot about it. Get you a creature if nothing else. Big fan of this card. I'll give it a 3. Rapacious Dragon. Awesome card here. This not only fixes your mana when it comes into play, but gives you a relatively fat flyer for at least a decent cost. You could do better as far in terms of rate, but it's still not bad at all. So I'll give this card a 3.5. I think I'll play it in my red decks pretty much every time. Scampering Scorcher, a little bit lower on. This does give you a huge board all at one time. All at once. I know you want to get your 2 cents in there, Ziggy. He's always got an opinion. But I still say, even with the board in a box, which I tend to love, I'm not super high on this. I think it really goes well with the 2-mana thing that reanimates stuff when it attacks. But at the same, it does, Ziggy. Shush. But at the same time, I'm just not a huge fan of like 3 power for 4 mana. Even with the haste, it's just okay. It's just okay. So I'll give it a 2. Play it in some decks. Uncaged Fury might be the best combat trick in the entire format, even at 3 mana. That's a lot for a combat trick, but this can either, you know, come out of nowhere and make a creature win a combat exchange, or it can just get a creature through for the win out of nowhere. So just really nice card here, and I'd play 1 copy of Fury in pretty much all of my aggressive sealed decks. So sorry, I had to remove Ziggy from the scene. Sorry, but I love you. But I'd probably still give this a 1.5, because not every deck will want this. Unchained Berserker is, you know, okay. The thing about this is it's playable too, even if you're not playing against white. You might just want a 2-mana 3/1. Like, this could make your the cut, period. So I'll give this a 1, because again, you might play it some of the time if you're trying to fill out your curve. Active Treason, solid, time-tested, sealed card for red aggressive decks, but really doesn't do much for other decks, so I'll just give this a 1.5, which is pretty much the score Active Treason usually would get in the sealed environment. It's just, again, if you're not playing aggressively, there's almost no reason to play Act, and if you're not sacrificing creatures, there's no reason to play Act. This does go well with Bone Splinters, both of these at the common level, but still, I don't love Active Treason. This is another card I'm not as high on as a lot of other players, so I think a 1.5 is where I'll put it here. Chandra's Embercat, I think, is okay with 30 elementals in the format, but still just a curve filler. It's a bear, 2 mana, 2/2. Sometimes it'll give you some value, sometimes it won't, but it'll still be decent. If you do get any Chandras in your sealed pool, it's okay, maybe. So I think it's, you know, at least worth taking a look at, but I probably wouldn't rate it more than a 1.5. Chandra's Outrage is premier removal at the common level. This is one of the best commons in the entire color here. Just 4 mana seems like a lot, but the instant speed matters a ton here, and 4 damage to a creature will take out most creatures in the sealed environment. So even though it's not unconditional, it's still easily one of the best removal pieces red has access to. You'll play it pretty much every time, despite the double color cost, so I'll give it a 4. This is a great card. Daggercell Aeronaut, also not bad. You know, it doesn't have flying on your opponent's turn, which means it doesn't block super well. And doesn't block your opponent's flyers and such, but the ability to have flying on your turn is just good enough. It's just good enough. What is this, a Snapping Drake on your turn? And that's okay. Snapping Drake is a fine card in Limited, so I'll give this a 2. Destructive Digger is fine, I guess. This gives you a rummage ability on a stick, sort of a rummage. Sacrifice an artifact or land, draw a card. Is not quite rummage, it's just a sacrifice. At a pretty steep cost, but still gives you the ability in the late game to like sack ancillary lands you don't need anymore and try to get some value. And I actually think that's okay, especially since the stats aren't that bad to begin with. So we'll label this a 2 as well. Fire Elemental, always better than you think it is, I promise. A 5/4 body for 5 mana is okay, because I don't mind paying 5 mana for for a 4/4 body. That much, at least, in terms of curve fillers. So the extra point of power can sometimes mean a lot. And even though there's not keyword abilities on this just stock vanilla creature, I still give it a 2 because Fire Elemental worms its way into a bunch of red sealed decks. Goblin Bird Grabber, I really like. Just 2 mana for a 2/1 is going to make its way into your deck as a curve filler some of the time. But in lieu of a creature like Pegasus Courser, those creatures that we get like every set now, that whenever they attack, they give a creature flying, this is sort of a take on those, but instead of like giving a creature flying, this is just what if you have any creature with flying, this grabs onto it for just a mana. I have a Goblin Balloon Brigade take too. I like that, kind of the callback. So big fan of this card. If you're looking to fill your curve, especially if you're building like Boros Flyers or Azorius, or excuse me, not Azorius Flyers, but like Is It Flyers, I think this is a very, very good card and probably better than it looks at first glance in terms of just bears, curve fillers. And I'll give this a 2.5. I'd probably play this in most decks, especially if I had the requisite number of flyers to do so. Goblin Smuggler, again, a little bit better than it looked. 3 mana, 2/2 haste. Not the best stats, but at least you get the haste to brighten your day a little bit. Really good in aggressive decks. If you're trying to get a little bit of reach to get creatures through in the late game, make sure you just finish the opponent off. This can deal up to 4 damage over just 2 turns. 6 damage over 3 turns. So I do like this card. And note, too, the old trick of like go ahead and activating Goblin Smuggler, attacking with the creature, and then pumping it with an instant speed combat trick. You can do that. It's still unblockable. It's pretty crazy. So I do like this card, and I'd probably play it. I think it's one of the stronger commons, especially for aggressive decks in particular, but kind of only for aggressive decks. So I'll give it a 2, but I do think it's a pretty good card. Infuriate, a pretty good example of a combat trick like I was just talking about. And it's almost a giant growth, so you know it's a pretty good card in the sealed environment. Plus, you know, we're not trying to get over things like Lightning Strike or Lava Coil in the sealed environment. We're really mostly trying to get over like shock effects and stuff. Like you see shock down here. There's also Disfigure in black. So at the common level, there's a lot of -2s and stuff that are going to show up in people's decks, and Infuriate can go above all of those, save them from those, save your creatures from those effects. So I'll actually give Infuriate like a 1.5. Good combat trick, really good for aggressive decks, and also saves your creatures from damage-based removal. Not bad. Keldon Raider, I've never liked the 3 toughness on this 4-drop, but Rummaging is at least okay, and it's a decent sort of bread and butter curve filler too, so I'll give this a 1.5. Lavakin Brawler, if you have a bunch of elementals, this is actually a pretty good rate. If you can get this to, you know, a 3/4 when it attacks just by having 1 other elemental, it's actually not so bad for the raid. But if you have 2 elementals, it's a great raid. You have 3 elementals, it's insane. By the way, it does count itself, so it'll always be a 3/4 when it attacks. Do keep that in mind. But if you have, you know, 2 other elementals on the battlefield, this becomes a 5 power thing when it attacks. That's really good for 4 mana. So I like the card. And again, especially if you support it enough, I think this could easily be a card with a very high ceiling. But just generally kind of a median rating, I'll give this a 2. I think it's a fine card. Maniacal Rage, there's actually different ways you can use this. Note that the sneaky hidden mode on it is to use it in an aggressive deck to get past a creature when you don't care about your life total and all you need to do is get in. Throw this on one of your opponent's creatures and it can't block. So that's pretty neat. But of course you can just throw this on your own creatures because you don't care about blocking. It's very good in aggressive decks, and Red has a ton of really nice pieces for these aggressive decks, as you would expect it to. But I really like the sort of what they've done with the building blocks. In terms of making red a really good color in combat and a really aggressive color as well. So this is kind of one of those key pieces for aggressive decks. Especially if you get like a fencing ace, this card is just unbelievable. It combos well with a couple of things, and also combos well with a variety of flyers in the format. 2 mana for +2/+2 is nothing, so this is actually a better card than it looks like too, and I'll give it a 2.5. Pack Mastiff is bad. You need multiple copies of it to be truly good, although again, 2 mana 2/2 is at least a curve filler, and it's got a mana sink that breathes fire. So even if you only have 1 Pack Mastiff, you can at least sometimes trade up, so it's not terrible. I'll give it a 1.5. Reckless Airstrike is probably not main deckable, so I'll just give it a 0.5, but actually I think I'll bump it up to a 1 because of all the sideboard cards in the format, it's one of the most main deckable. You will almost certainly run into flyers in sealed this time around in game 1. And aside from that, sometimes it'll take out the odd artifact too, just randomly, so I actually don't think the card is bad. It's a little bit of control against all these good uncommon artifacts. So I think the card is almost main deckable, but not quite. I say I'll bump it up to a 1. Reduced to Ashes is insane for removal. It may be sorcery speed and it may be 5 mana, but you'll probably play up to 2 copies of this and possibly even 3 if you get them. So I'll give the card a 3.5. It's premium removal in red and almost unconditional in this environment. Ripscale Predator is a 6 mana 6/5, so the stats are there. But I'm not sure how consequential the menace is. I've always had this thought that the bigger the creature gets, especially in limited, the less potent menace is, because they're most likely going to try to double block it anyway, or at least they're a little more likely to try to if the creature's big. So this will force them to get rid of 2 creatures at the least if they do want to block it, and that's pretty good. I'll give you that much. So I'll give the card a 1.5. I think it'll make the cut some of the time. Scorch Spitter is at least an elemental. Well, I should say Predator, by the way, is I think one of the only common dinosaurs. Keep that in mind. But Scorch Spitter is a decent elemental 1-drop, but not as good as some of the other 1-drops in the set. That said, I think in an aggressive deck I would probably play as many copies of this as I got if I was trying to be extremely aggressive, but only in those decks, so I'll give it like a 1. Shock, premium removal. Play every copy of this that you get really good against smaller creatures and to finish off creatures after combat and such. So I'll give Shock a 3.5. You just play it every time. Tectonic Rift, also, again, I feel like a broken record here, but ridiculously good in aggressive decks. Don't even worry about destroying a land. Sometimes that can be good, and if your opponent's kind of tripped up on dropping lands and is sort of falling behind in that avenue on turn 4, only has 3 lands out or whatever, this can sometimes just completely screw them. But this is also pretty decent in the late game to just blow them out and get a good attack step in. That said, Rift isn't as good as it usually is because there's almost twice as many flying creatures as usual. So keep that in mind. I'll still give Tectonic Rift a 1. It's playable in these aggressive decks, which is mostly what red is all about. You could always say that for red. Red is obviously the most aggressive color, hands down, but they have done a really good job of sort of projecting the aggression and maximizing the aggression in red. Not only is it the most aggressive color as it should be, but it's the most aggressive color by a factor of at least 3. Just a lot of aggression here. And yeah, if you're trying to build that kind of deck, I think red has a ton of really good pieces for you. If you do get the right things in your sealed pool, you're going to build a really fast deck in red. But note, there's not a ton of amazing, red 1-drops, not even a ton of amazing red 2-drops. That does cut down your aggression just a little bit, but there's a lot of ways to break through in the late game, a lot of good removal, and overall, I'll give red a B+. I think it's a solid color. Now, to be honest, I'm really tempted to give red a B, and there's lots of reasons for that, but some of the uncommons are just so insane for red in the set. Rapacious Dragon, Mask of Immolation's at least okay, Flame Sweep's very good, Ember Hauler, Chandra, these uncommons are just crazy, and a lot of the commons are at least decent removal or playable creatures that are very aggressive too, so I like a lot about what red has to offer. I will give it a pretty good grade of B+, but most of the colors are pretty darn good this time around. So let's take a look at the last color. We still got to do artifacts and lands and stuff too, but the last color is green, and green is okay this time around. We'll get to talking about it. Vivian is at least removal, and even at 4 mana at sorcery speed that requires you to have a decent creature on the battlefield, I will still take it in green. So I give the card a 3.5, and it's very, very good in long game scenarios. Really good to helping you break stalemates. As a matter of fact, we'll bump it up to a 4. Let's bump it up to a 4. Because this not only helps you break stalemates over the course of a turn or two, Trample is obviously a very desirable ability in sealed when you do stall against the opponent, or when you're just trying to sort of break the ranks of each other's board state. That can be a very good first ability. And obviously being able to kill stuff is crazy too. So let's bump this up to a 4. Cavalier of Thorns is, I think, the worst Cavalier. Both for constructed and sealed. Sometimes you will whiff on this when you play it and you try to get a land. Often you won't, but ramp is probably the least desirable of most of these ETB triggers on Cavaliers. Now, that said, the dice trigger is very, very good on this and will always get you some kind of value, I would imagine, unless you just have a completely naked graveyard. This will do something for you, and there's something to be said for that. So even if your opponent kills this, they're not out of the fire. And a 5/6 reach blocks almost every important flyer. Actually, I think every important flyer in the format and kills it. So that's really good. There's something to be said for that, but I'd be much happier if the creature just flew. That said, this is green. Creature has to have reach. So I'll still give this a 4. If you're in green, you play it, but As far as Cavaliers go, it may be the weakest of that cycle. Now, Elvish Reclaimer is another rare that's just kind of okay, I guess. Like, this will thin your thin your deck over the course of a few turns, although that will come at a price. There's really not a whole lot of lands that you want to search up that are super exciting in this in this environment, but this can be what effectively a 1-mana 3/4, and that's at least okay. But there's really not much to write home about on this. I'll just give it like a 1.5. It's all right. Gargus Vicious Warrior or Watcher is 6 mana, and that's a lot, and a heavy commitment to green, you know, just like the Cavaliers. But it's crazy. It's a fairly decent card. Ignore the Hydra spells text on this. That really doesn't matter almost at all, except for like Voracious Hydra. You see it right below there. But I'm not worried about the Hydra text at all. What I'm worried about is a 6 mana 8/7 Vigilance. What I'd really like is Trample on this card, but it's still just consequence free, gets to attack, just whittle down your opponent's defenses. And if your opponent ever does want to use one of their very important removal spells on one of your creatures, you get to take out one of their creatures too. Pretty much no questions asked. So if you can get the card on the battlefield, I think it's going to do a lot of work for you, but that's easier said than done. I'll give it a 4. Leyline of Abundance is bad. This is a fairly bad card. Pretty decent late game mana sink, but we're talking extremely late game. So I don't really like the card at all. I'll give it a 0 as well. Nightpack Ambusher is insanely good. A 4-mana 4/4, decent stats and sealed by itself, but this also has flash, so you can play it as a removal piece during the opponent's combat step. There are wolves in this set. I think there are 5 total cards that will give you wolves, something like that, and most of them are at lower rarities. I think this is the only one. This is also the only payoff for playing wolves, period, but pretty good one, right? So if you've got a few wolves, this is actually pretty nice just as an anthem effect, but this creates its own wolves too on turns where like you just draw a land or something. And there's going to be turns where you draw a decent card but you don't cast it. You know, because why would you? I'd rather have the wolf in some of these situations. So Ambusher is just a card that must be answered, fills your board turn by turn, and is a pretty decent threat in and of itself. Sometimes takes out a creature when it hits the battlefield. I'm in love with this stupid thing, so I'll give it a 4.5. Shared Summons is fine. You know, this is green card advantage at a really hefty price, but at least it's instant speed, so you might not even really be spending mana on it. You know, if you are untapped and you play this at the end of your opponent's turn, you just immediately untap. That's how instant works. So this might just be almost consequence-free card advantage for the 2 best creatures in your deck. And I'm willing to bet you drafted up or got a bunch of bombs in your sealed pool that you really would like to play. Shared Summons helps you play them, but it's not the best card in the world, let's be honest. Let's give it a 2. Shifting Ceratops is crazy. This is a 4-mana 5/4, so you play it. But it's also pro-blue. It's pretty good, it turns out, in this environment. And you can make it gain reach to kill all those flyers and stuff, so that's nice. Trample to get through the line. Like, all of this is very nice. If you have extra mana, you can also just attack with it the turn it comes out. It's a crazy card. Just on stats alone, it's an insane card. So I'll give this a 4.5. You play it every time you get it and you're in green. Voracious Hydra, pretty nice too, I will say. This is green removal too, and we've already seen a couple of cards like that. Nightpack Ambusher can be removal. Let me go up a little bit, sorry. Gargos, that's removal. This won't be the last thing we see either. So a lot of good like green traditional fight-based removal here. And this could be very, very good in the late or even mid-game. And I like that about it. I would play Voracious Hydra. Let's give this a 3.5. Let's give this a... No, it's got the trample. I really like the trample on a card like this. Especially rip it off the top in the late game. It's just unbelievable. It can be the biggest creature ever. So I'll give it a 4. I think you definitely play it. It always makes the cut, and it can be a huge bomb too. Rake Root Elemental is also a crazy bomb that you'll almost never be able to activate the ability on unless you're in mono green, which I don't recommend in most sealed environments. This is not the most attractive thing in the world, but a 6-mana 5/5 will at least win you some games sometimes. I gotta give it a 3. Bark-Eyed Troll, on the other hand. Very good card. Very good card, mi amigos. This is a 2-mana 3/3, which is at least okay, but this also just shrugs off removal at least once, and that's great. That's like really great. So I'm going to give Bark-Eyed Troll a 4. I think of the cycle of 2-mana creatures that cost 2 of their respective color, this is pretty easily the best, especially in a format like Sealed, where creatures that can shirk off removal are at a premium, and this is one of the only ones, so that's how you play it if you're heavy green. Howling Giant, another wolf thing, sort of. It gives you 2 wolves. And even though this is extremely steep, it's going to block most of the flyers in the format and pay off, while also filling your board a lot, like a lot. And it obviously combos with Night Pack Ambusher to give you like 9 power. But even if you don't have an Ambusher, it still gives you 7 power and a 5/5 reach. So I think it might be worth 7 mana, especially if you have any ramp elements whatsoever. This is a pretty good payoff for an uncommon. So I'll give it a 2. And that does mean I think it's playable. Loaming Shaman, I think is a little bit better than it looks, but still not that great. 3 mana, 3/2, nothing to write home about, but okay stats. And the fact that this will let you get back, not to your hand, but at least into your library. Any big bombs or other important cards you may have lost over the course of a game can actually be pretty nice. So as a curve filler, I'll give this a 2. Might of the Masses, decent combat trick. If you're in a go wide kind of Selesnya strategy, then it really gains a lot of value. But for the most part, I just give this card a 1/2 point. It's not usually great, and you have to set up a lot to really pay this card off. Overcome, on the other hand, pretty playable, Overrun effect, you know? Overcome is just a callback to Overrun, and we have seen Overcome before. This is a reprint. But it is a great stall breaker in green. You get to the mid or late game, so sometimes just win the game for you, but it will sit in your hands some of the time until you get to that point. That said, sometimes too, you just cast it on turn 5 on curve, and it's crazy if you've been able to cast creatures up to then, and it finishes the game in a number of situations for you. So I'll give the card a 2.5. I think you played 1 copy, but probably not anymore. Overgrowth Elemental is one of my favorite cards in the set. In terms of design, I really like this card a lot. 3 mana for a 3/2, again, not the best stats, but at least okay. And there's so much elemental support for this that I think it's probably main deckable in most decks carrying green. You're almost certainly going to have plenty of elementals. Even in sealed, you'll very likely have elementals to support this. So the fact that this can put an extra point of power on the battlefield when it hits the battlefield and gradually get bigger as the game goes on, while also triggering any life gain, goodness that you got going on, so much that the card does. Pays off life gain, pays off elementals, decent stats to start out with. I'll give the card a 3. I think it's actually pretty good. Season of Growth, I also think is pretty good. I don't want to take off a turn to play this, but I will say if you have some combat tricks in your deck, or if you're playing the auras thing, if you somehow get that in sealed, more of a thing in draft definitely, but if you somehow are able to get this deck in sealed, Season of Growth is a great card for it. And for that matter, I'm talking about the second ability. The first ability, you're playing creatures in any sealed deck, and scrying 1 is actually a lot better than it looks. So I think this is probably pretty playable, but it won't always pay off every single turn, so that docks its score a little bit. I'll give it a 2.5, which still means it's a pretty darn good card. Thrashing Brontodon, 3 mana 3/4 is good enough already. This will take out the odd artifact or enchantment, but at its mana cost, for its rate, it's one of the biggest creatures in the entire environment. Seriously, it is. So we'll give this a 2.5. It's going to make the cut most of the time. Veil of Summer, sideboard card, but a very, very good one against most removal spells, especially black removal spells. I'll just give it a 0.5 point, but it is a very good sideboard card. Wolf Rider's Saddle, ladies and gentlemen. I actually really like too, but I've liked all these living equipments. This one's no different. It gives you a 4 mana 3/3, which isn't the best thing in the world, obviously, but the fact that you can just equip that power to something else is pretty nice. Again, not the best of these living equipments, but still a good playable card. Woodland Champion, not great in this format, even though we do have stuff like Raise the Alarm and Ferocious Pup over here. There are ways to expand your board all at one time, like the red format elemental that puts 3 different things on the battlefield. That can be okay too, so I don't dislike the card, but I think there's so few payoffs for it that it's probably not worth playing as more than curve filler, so I'm just going to give it a 1. Brightwood Tracker, I actually really like. The activated ability is insanely steep, but it's still really good. Looking at the top 4 and getting any of those, one of those creatures is nice in the late game, and green needs a decent card advantage piece, so I'd probably play at least 1 copy of this, if not 2 for that matter. 4 mana 2/4 is not great stats, but it still blocks on the ground okay, and really the card advantage ability is all there is to look at here, so I'd give this a 2 because I'm probably going to end up playing it in a lot of decks. Centaur Courser, vanilla, 3 mana 3/3, it's alright, we'll give it a 1.5. Feral Invocation, this is a decent card, it turns out, especially again in the aura decks. This can kind of play like removal in that it's a combat trick. If your opponent gets in because they think that you're smaller than them, this can really take them by surprise. I like that. And obviously it's great in aura based decks, which you have again a chance of building, although it is very, very slim. So I like the card a little bit. I'll give it a 1.5. Ferocious Pup, I kind of like. This puts 2 bodies on the battlefield. At least get you a 2/2 and a 0/1. That's okay, but It's not near as good as like Yavimaya Sap Herd or other cards of this ilk. With that said, you can unlock an achievement with this too. You know, if you get the Wolf Lord in rare that has flash, that thing, then suddenly you can attack for a point of damage with Ferocious Pup. My goodness, the doggo, the good boy, grows up a little bit. So again, that's heartwarming, but that's more of a fun achievement than anything else. That said, though, I think Ferocious Pup is a perfectly playable 3-drop, and I'll give it a 2. Gift of Paradise. I like that this is in the common slot in this format. I've always liked Gift. This is some of the only really good ramp that we have in this set for green, but again, it's at the common level, and you're going to play it some of the time, especially if you're trying to get to some of these really big drops in this set. There are multiple 7 drops in like every single color, and Gift of Paradise can help you get to both 6s and 7s while also keeping you in the game a little longer and paying off life gain strategies, which is a real consideration. I think Gift of Paradise is a better card than it usually is. I'll give it a 2.5. Greenwood Sentinel is just okay. Again, looking to fill your curve out, it's alright. Let's give it a 1.5. Growth Cycle. If you have multiple copies of it, the card is probably like a 3, but as it is, it's still a decent combat trick. +3/+3 is a lot for 2, in sealed at least. Excuse me, I had to cough there. I apologize. One cough the entire video. Please afford me that. But still, I think this is okay if you get multiple copies of it, but even if you don't, it's alright. So I'll give it like a 1.5. It's alright. Healer of the Glade, I'm really intrigued by. It has the right creature type, and it's really good in life gain strategies, and it's really good against aggressive strategies if you're trying to build a mid-range thing that tries to get a little bit later in the game, cast these 6 and 7 drops, and just take over the board. I actually really like a lot about this card, even as a 1-drop. I do like it, so I'll give it a 1.5. I think it will get cut some of the time, but make the cut others. Leafkin Druid, another pretty good ramp piece, and one of the only other good ramp pieces we get in the entire set for green. But still, a 2-mana 0/3 will never attack, obviously, but just tapping it for a green is good enough if you happen to have multiple, like 4 or more creatures out, really 3 other creatures out. And this is obviously insanely good, so really good ramp if you're able to use it for those purposes. But just on its own, just the 3 toughness creature that taps for a mana for 2, it's kind of a Druid of the Cow, and that's okay. We'll give it a 2. Mammoth Spider is great. There are 2 spiders on your screen right now. Don't freak out. But there are 2 spiders on your screen right now, and both of them are really, really good in this sealed environment specifically. Mammoth Spider, I mean, just again, 40 flying creatures. How many times do I have to say it? So, reach on a decently statted creature is insanely important in this sealed environment, and really gives green a way to compete with these flying decks. It really needs a way to compete with all the flying creatures. So these really help out with that, and Mammoth Spider is especially already a pretty decent card in most limited environments. So play it, I would say. Like, play at least 1 or 2 copies if you get these and you need to fill out the 5-drop slot. Mammoth Spider is actually really, really good. It's a heads-up card in this limited environment because of all the flyers. Let's go ahead and give it a 3. Natural End, sideboard card, but does enable life gain stuff. We'll give it a 0.5. Let's give it a 1. Let's give it a 1, you guys. Let's do it. Netcaster Spider. What does it matter? Netcaster Spider, a lot like Mammoth Spider, in that it blocks these flyers and can even kill bigger flyers, usually at the expense of it dying too, but can kill bigger flyers than Mammoth Spider. That said, just, yes, you gotta have this to combat creatures with flying, because there's going to be a ton of them. I'll give this a 3 as well. Plummet. Storyteller creature with flying, the best it's ever been in a sealed environment. It might actually be main deckable, everybody. Seriously, keep Plummet in mind. I might put a copy of this in my main deck if I get it at the pre-release and I'm on green. But anyway, we'll give it a 1. Again, usually this is a sideboard card, which is a 0.5, but I'll give it a 1. I really think this might be main deckable, and if it is, then it really deserves like a 3, right? It's a pretty good card. Pulse of Murasa, one of my favorite green cards in this entire set. I love Pulse. This is instant speed, so you can almost consequence-free cast it at the end of your opponent's turn. Gain just 6 life. Not only is that a huge chunk of life against aggressive decks, but also, of course, you want to gain life. Green-white life gain is a real deck. Abzan life gain might be a thing. Black-green life gain is a thing for some reason in this environment. But, you know, being able to get back a creature, too, is just really big in the mid and late game in sealed. Get back that big bomb that you somehow lost, your opponent had an answer to. I have always loved Pulse. Even in constructed, I like this card, but I know I shouldn't, but in sealed, I especially like it. Even though it doesn't affect the board immediately, it's still a very good card, make no mistake. I'll give this a 2.5. Rabid Bite, also very good card. This is straight up green removal, and I'll give it a 4. This card is very important to green. Sedge Scorpion. I'll give this a 2.5. I like my 1 mana 1/1 Death Touchers. I'll give it a 2. Well, I'll give it a 2. I'll give it a 2. I don't want to go too crazy. We'll give it a 2. Silverback Shaman, I think is one of the best green commons, hands down. 5 mana for a 5/4, at least decent. Trample, that's great on a 5-power creature. And when it dies, draw a card, like, yes, ma'am. That's so good. I think this is easily one of the premier, like, breakout green commons in the set. Even though 5 mana is a little bit expensive, I think it's worth every penny. And I'd probably want to give this a 3. I think this is... yeah, this is 3 territory. Thicket Crasher. 4 mana, 4/3. Again, I don't like the toughness on this, but 4 mana, 4 power, trample, lots of elementals in the set to pay off. This is probably also a 3. Another one of the premier commons for green. Vorse Claw, 6 mana for a 7/7, doesn't do anything else but besides be an elemental, which might be kind of important. So that all that said, it's no Colossal Dreadmaw or anything, but I'll still give it a 2. It's probably a pretty decent curve topper and a really threatening card to have to deal with. Wolfkin Bond. Now this card, we usually see it in white. But it's always, again, better than it looks in sealed. +2/+2 to a creature is great, especially with all the flying creatures in the format. That's great. It pays off wolves if you want to do that, but also just puts a wolf on the battlefield. That's cool. So you get a creature out of this, if nothing else. Sometimes a 4/4 creature. But other times you'll get a 2/2 creature, and you'll end up with like a 6/6 flyer or something. It's just so good. Wolfkin Bond doesn't look like the best card in the world, but it's one of the better auras in the set, because even if you get blown out, quote-unquote blown out, and you lose the creature the aura goes on, then you still got a creature. You still leave some value on the battlefield. That's one of the sneakiest, best things about this card, is even if you lose the aura and the creature it's attacked to, you're not actually getting 2 for 1. Really, really important there, so I'll give Wolfkin Bond a 2. With that said, I think green is probably the weakest color in the set. Yeah, it's got Mammoth Spider, it's got the other spider, and a couple of really premier commons here down towards the bottom. Rabid Bite, Sedge Scorpion, Silverback Shaman, Thicket Crasher. These are all really good, but I still don't think that green is super strong looking in this format. It does ramp okay with Gift of Paradise and the new Druid of the Cowl in the 2-drop slot, and it does have some stuff you want to ramp into. So like, it's doing green stuff, but I still think that, especially when compared to the raw power level of some of the other colors in this set, I'm just not really seeing a whole lot in green that really draws me into this color, or really sees it as a great support color for the other colors, unless maybe you're trying to do the life game thing. Or just play, green-black value, big creatures and removal and stuff. Like, there's always a place for that in the format. But I still don't think that green is a very impressive color, especially when compared to what they did with some of the other colors here. So, that said, I'll give green a C+. I really don't think that green got a fair shake this time around. But don't think we're done. Oh, no. Don't think we're done. Because we got to do artifacts and lands next up here, but that's not too much to talk about, some of these we've already talked about, like all the colored ones, but there's plenty to talk about other than that. Bag of Holding is actually a pretty sweet card. This can end up getting you a ton of value over the course of a game, and I'd probably almost always play. Like, I don't really see much opportunity cost to putting this in the deck, other than it's not removal or a body, but it's still great card selection over the course of the game, and relatively cheap card selection at that. Like, sometimes cashes in for like 4, 5, 6 cards in the late game, so I'd probably make room for this in my sealed deck. I'll give it a 3.5. Golos Tireless Pilgrim isn't the best thing in the world, but the stats are at least there. 5 mana 3/5s are playable creatures in limited, and even though this doesn't do, like, you'll never activate this ability. Very, very likely you will not activate this ability. But that said, searching your library for a land card and ramping is at least okay. We've seen a ton of 6 and 7 drops so far in the sealed environment, so sometimes this will actually ramp you to something even bigger than that. And again, 5 mana 3/5 any deck can play is pretty good, so I'll give the card a 3. Grafdigger's Cage, sideboard, half a point. Icon of, and you probably won't even cite it in that much. Icon of Ancestry is not actually great. Unless you're in elementals and you got a ton of them or something, I probably would stay off of this card. This can, however, get you some card advantage, and I actually think that's the best part of the card. Is if you are playing, like, I don't know, 7, 8 elementals in your deck, you could probably end up drawing 1 or 2 over the course of the game with this, and that's pretty nice. So I'll give it a 1.5. Much better constructed than sealed, though. Now, Mystic Forge is basically unplayable in sealed. We'll give this a 0, but it's one of my favorite cards to look out for constructed, so keep that in mind. Steel Overseer, a little bit better, but very often it won't really put any counters on anything besides itself. But the ability to put counters on itself is pretty good, so I'll give it a 1. Ancestral Blade already talked about, Altar already talked about, all of these colored uncommon artifacts we've done. Colossus Hammer is fairly bad, actually. If you can ever equip this to something, it's okay. But the creature loses flying, which I don't like. You do all that hard work and your creature loses flying because it can't lift the stupid giant hammer. But so I'm just not a huge fan of this. Diamond Knight, I think it's just okay. You know, this will take a few turns to really pay off, and it's not even guaranteed to pay off like every turn unless it's the relatively early or mid game and you're very heavy in one color. So I'm not actually a huge fan of this. I'll just give it a 1. Diviner's Lockbox is way too tricky. Way too tricky. I guess if you combine this with the Scry lands, it can draw you a bunch of cards, but I really doubt that's going to come up all the time. I'll just give the card a 0.5. Manifold Key doesn't really have that much to do, but it can make things unblockable for just the 1 mana initial investment and be a great mana sink to make those creatures unblockable. So I do think this is at least playable in most decks, especially decks with like big creatures, so I'll give it a 3. That's a pretty high score for this card, but again, just a thing that makes your guys unblockable is crazy. Meteor Golem. Keep in mind it's a golem. Keep in mind all of these things that are golems for Master Splicer, but Meteor Golem, as far as 7 mana cards go, I'm going to shock you, is actually one of the best in the entire set. Being able to kill anything you want when this comes into play non-land is actually always pretty good in sealed, so I don't mind Meteor Golem. I'll give the card a 2. It probably could be a 1.5, but I'll give it a 2. Pattern Matcher is bad in sealed specifically. It's very likely you won't have another creature to go search up. You might, but few and far between. We'll give it a 1, 0.5. We'll give it a 0.5. Retributive Wand is pretty good, actually. Just being able to have something that like deals the damage every turn is kind of just okay. And if you can find a way to kill it yourself, being able to just like hit for 5 is really nice. You can kill a creature, you can hit your opponent for 5, basically like Shrapnel Blast. You know, it's actually pretty good, but the ways of doing that are few and far between. I'd probably give the card a 0.5, but I think there's some really fun stuff you can do with it in Constructed. Salvager of Ruin, nice. 3 mana, 2/1, not the best stats or anything, but the ability to get back something that died in combat this turn or whatever is kind of okay. So I'll give Salvager of Ruin like a 1. It's at least playable. Scuttlemutt. Maybe my best name, my favorite name for a card in the entire set. But it's pretty bad. This is mostly meant to play against the cards with protection from X or whatever, and it's bad. It's a fairly bad card, so we'll give it like a 0.5. Anvil Rot Raptor is 4 mana 2 on Flying First Strike, and those are fairly bad stats, even though it flies. Do note, though, it's a flyer any deck can play, and sometimes it'll actually be a pretty good blocker against the flying decks. You know, any of them with 2 toughness or less, this takes out without dying. Might actually be pretty good. I'll give it a 1.5. Heartpiercer Bow is okay. It's always just been okay, but not much to write home about. I'll give it a 1. Marauder's Axe probably goes pretty good on some of the flying creatures in the format, and it's relatively cheap to both cast and equip. I'll actually give this like a 2.5. Marauder's Axe can really do a lot of work for you over the course of a game and turns even your small guys into pretty decent sized threats. Prismite goes really well in like 3 color decks that are looking to splash that 3rd color, but outside of that, it's not great. That said, it is a curve topper or a curve filler any deck can play. A 2 mana 2/1 is nothing to sneeze at, but it's also nothing to get super excited about, so I'll just give the card a 1.5. Stolen Golem is a 5 mana 4/4. I accept those stats, but I'm never excited about those either. The card gets a 1. Vial of Dragonfire, on the other hand, is actually not so bad. You know, 2 mana to cast, a total investment of 4 damage for your shock that any deck can play, including like green and blue cards, colors that don't have access to a lot of good removal. So, depending on what deck this is in, the score can actually go up, but I will give Vial a score of at least 2.5 here because I'll end up playing it in a lot of my decks. This is a card I'm a little higher on than a lot of other players because it's removal. You play removal. But aside from that, let's go ahead and finish it up with what little lands there are in the set. You play all these temples if you're in the colors. You just play them. Same thing with these gain lands, and note these pay off the life gain strategies. So things like Jungle Hollow and Scoured Barrens and Blossoming Sands, these are just like better than the other ones because those are the colors you're going to be trying to gain life in. And then finally, Field of the Dead is pretty bad. Like, I guess you could do some tricky thing if you get an Elvish Reclaimer too, where you just like search up 8 different lands over the course of like 5 different turns. Like, this seems really, really bad, but it could work. That said, I give Field of the Dead like a 0. It's never going to happen. Lotus Field, one of my favorite cards in the set in terms of just like personal favorites. I can't even argue the card is amazing or anything and constructed, but it's okay. It's still at least okay. We're doing some stuff with it, but that said, in limited, it's just fairly bad. It can at least help you cast Cavaliers, and pretty much every color has another heavy commitment card that costs 3 mana of a given color in it. So I do like Lotus Field for helping cast those, but I still don't think the card is any bigger than like a 0.5. You probably don't play those. Even though you play it just for the points, just for the cred. You're like, man, check it out, Lotus Field, bruh. Or sis. Just try to impress people with your Lotus Field or make them angry that you pulled that, even though it's not really that expensive right now. Still just a crazy, fun, nostalgic card, so I'd probably play it in my deck, but I wouldn't expect it to do much work. I'll give it a point. I'll give it a half a point too. Cryptic Caves is actually probably the best of these lands, except for maybe the Scry lands. I really like this in the late game. Just being able to draw a card for a mana and sacking it is actually kind of fantastic, and any deck can play it. If you're in like a 2-color or less deck, you can easily fit this land. So you get a copy or 2 of it. I'd probably play up to 2 copies of it. It's actually, drawing a card in the late game is great, so I'll give this card like a 3. It's actually really good. And Evolving Wilds, bread and butter. You play this if you're in, again, a 3-color deck that's trying to splash a color. This can be invaluable, but it's actually pretty good in 2-color decks too. I've always liked Evolving Wilds. I'll give the card a 2.5, but that, unless you want to count basic lands, you got to play those. But that is it, ladies and gentlemen, boys and ghouls. We made it. We actually did the whole damn thing. That is insane, y'all. I don't know how far we are into the video. It's probably like 8 hours, and I'm in some sort of time warp, and I'm losing my perception of reality here. But still, I think that was actually fairly succinct, and we pulled it off. And thanks everyone who is actually still here listening to this video. If you enjoyed the whole thing, make sure you like, subscribe, blah blah blah. TCG player, first link in the description. Donate to my Patreon if you really liked my stupid face, even though you didn't get to see it, or Ziggy's in this video. I apologize for that. We'll be back on camera real soon with a couple of list videos, but whew, I actually really enjoyed this, and I hope you all did too. Let me know if you want me to continue to do this when sets come out. I'll do it. I'll do it. Like I said, I had a lot of fun here today. So anyway, you're probably not even listening to this. You're done with the video, so I am gonna go ahead and get out of here. Do all the things. I'm Dev from the Place. Hope you enjoyed yourself. Thanks for watching, my wizards. I'll catch you cats later. Spread love and be kind.